listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your indefatigable, your ever vigilant, your last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would mean, more likely than not, you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Right on. How you doing, Shane? You doing okay?
I am all right. Yeah, I don't know how much you set this up yesterday, but I went home and it's sort of COVID scare thing. I mean, I'm doing okay, but I was just worried. I had some of the symptoms. I didn't want to potentially infect you because of everything that you've got going on. So I went home. I took the first test that came back negative. I'm still staying home, but I'm good overall. I'm good. How are you doing?
Excellent. Yeah, you freaked people out yesterday, to put it mildly. Shane came in yesterday. I think he was, 30 seconds or something like that. And he was like, yeah, man, I'm feeling miserable. And so, no, man, I'm glad you're doing okay.
I wasn't feeling particularly good. And then I left because I was feeling weird. I can explain it more when I understand it more. But I couldn't smell my tea. I went to make myself morning tea and I couldn't smell anything at all. So that was, and I was just like, at that moment, I was just like, yeah, I know that's a symptom. I should, and it was combined with other stuff in this way where I decided to pull the fire alarm, so to speak. Anyway.
No, that's
better
a good
safe
thing.
than sorry.
No, that's a good thing. Yeah, it is much better safe than sorry. We don't want you getting ill, or we don't want other people around the office get ill. So no, man. But I'm glad you're doing okay, and I'm glad that test came back negative. I remember once before where I ended up taking like 2 of those home tests because I got scared. It was like, oh God, I'm not feeling well. Is it COVID? Everything is COVID at this point. But no, man, I'm glad you're doing well, especially well enough to co-host. So welcome back.
Oh yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
So let's get into the headlines in the news. Yesterday, in the United States, there were 216,312 COVID cases reported, along with 1,876 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 83,365 cases per day, an increase of 3% from the average 2 weeks ago. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 70% of residents have received at least 1 dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 48,195,182 people across the United States and has killed an unfortunate 777,417 people in America. Men, women, and children. Top U.S. government officials are considering requiring everyone who enters the country to be tested for COVID-19 the day before their flight, and having all travelers, including U.S. citizens and permanent residents, be tested again after returning home regardless of their vaccination status. Officials were deliberating the potential changes Tuesday night, and no final decisions have been made. But the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention confirmed in a statement that the agency is working to revise testing requirements for travelers because of the Omicron variant. In national news, a 15-year-old boy is in custody after 3 students died and 8 were injured in a shooting Tuesday afternoon at a high school in Oxford, Michigan, authorities said. The Oxford high school student killed were a 16-year-old boy, a 14-year-old girl, a 17-year-old girl, Oakland County Undersheriff Michael G. McCabe said at a news conference. CNN is suspending primetime anchor Chris Cuomo indefinitely, pending further evaluation, after new documents reveal the cozy and improper nature of the relationship with his aides to his brother, former Governor Andrew Cuomo. Those documents were released on Monday by New York's Attorney General Letitia James. Andrew Cuomo, former Governor Andrew Cuomo, is not happy about that, making the point that this is politics and Letitia James is basically doing this for political effect. The way it doesn't look good. A woman who testified in the sex trafficking trial of Ghislaine Maxwell said she met the close confidant of Jeffrey Epstein and the billionaire businessman when she was 14 and eating ice cream with friends at a camp where he was a benefactor. He said he was a benefactor. Jane described in detail, or graphic detail, incidents of sexual abuse with Epstein that Maxwell would at times join in on. both in Palm Beach, Florida, and Manhattan when she was 14, 15, and 16 years old. Yeah, this was, like, we'll come back to it, but this was like a perfect example of this kind of grooming thing, where you get somebody who's very young and you bring the person up in order to kind of ingratiate yourself to them as you get older. Investigators in New Mexico were authorized by a state judge Tuesday to search Albuquerque prop store, where some of the rounds used on a set for the film Rust prior to the fatal shooting in October are believed to have been supplied. And in international news, Tel Aviv, Israel, has been named the most expensive city for living for the first time in a new survey conducted by the Economist Intelligence Unit. And in our holiday news, we have a month of giving, National Drunk and Drugged Driving Prevention Month, National Tire Month, National Write a Business Plan Month, Operation Santa Paws, Safe Toys and Gifts Month, Spiritual Literacy Month. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, so a few of these stories are uber interesting. So let's go to the first one. The Omicron variant. Top U.S. government officials are considering requiring everyone who enters the country to be tested for COVID-19 the day before their flight. Shane, this is kind of the rule in Europe anyway. I mean, like, as I read this just makes all the sense in the world. I mean, whether you have a vaccination status or not, so what? At this point, we know that people who are vaccinated can get COVID, even if it may shorten the duration, even if it may shorten the symptoms. We still know at the very least can still be infected by it, which means that just because you have a vaccination doesn't necessarily mean that you're completely safe, especially if you're going into another country. If you're just using the little thing, say, hey, I was vaccinated, I'm good. Yeah, not so much. Not so much. What are your thoughts on that?
I think this is exactly the kind of thing we should have been doing from the get-go effectively.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense. This is the least invasive way to handle this kind of thing. I mean, going back to the origins of COVID, there are a bunch of different approaches. Lockdowns were the extreme one, I will point out, in addition to just letting it run unravaged. But just internationally looking at how people responded to it, obviously China built pop-up centers, but you also had these constant pop-up hospitals. These constant test and trace programs initiated in East Asian countries where they were pretty effective at keeping it out. And of course, test and trace, a key component of that is test. We didn't have the testing in place in the United States or the software, to another topic, to get that kind of thing going. But increasing our testing capacity, making sure we have it in more places, that was like one of the early things a bunch of people were calling for. And we've still been kind of slow on,
Agreed.
I'm sad to say, where I experienced it for myself. It's technically as easy as going down to the CVS for me to pick up, or Walgreens or whatever, that kind of thing, to pick up an at-home test. But it could be easier and it could be more effective and it could be faster. It could be the kind of thing where, there's a local center without having to talk to anybody. And in just a couple of minutes, I get this, and don't wait 36 hours, 2 days. Anyway, I'm veering off into my own tangent. The point being, in the States, we need to improve our testing infrastructure. We should have had this kind of thing in place a long time ago, seriously. Yeah, especially for traveling.
1,000% agree. 1,000% agree. I mean, because you're right. I mean, if you are, let's say in Istanbul, for example, Istanbul had test centers all over the place. Georgia, same thing. Test centers all over the place. And it didn't take days. It took 1 day, maybe 12 hours. You had tests at the airports all over the place in Europe. It was basically pretty quickly. I mean, you have many of the countries that needed you to have a test within hours or within a day or so before going into the country. And so testing centers were everywhere. In the United States, that doesn't entirely seem to be the case. I mean, even from the standpoint of this ability to get, let's say if a person doesn't want a vaccine, having testing as the way of dealing with that particular individual. I mean, even that should be a potential. But again, that requires the testing to be easy and available and something that somebody can go to in pretty much, a few minutes, not necessarily something that would take hours or days. So, yeah, I agree with you on this one. This is something that should have been done from the get-go. The other story that's interesting that we definitely got to talk about, and Ted Rall is going to be here to talk about it. This is the Chris Cuomo basically being suspended pending further evaluation. Initially, if you remember, and this is going to be my monologue, but if you remember, Cuomo, when this first came up, meaning the brother, Chris Cuomo, he said, I listened to my brother and I just gave him my advice. That's as far as he went. He didn't go any further. Well, we find out that is nowhere near the truth. And even at the time, for just that part, which is on some level understandable, right? It's your brother, and you want to listen to your brother, and you want to be there for your brother. So fair enough. But he even noted that that was improper because of his stature and everything else at the network. Okay, fair enough. If that was improper, what he is accused of doing and what the documents show that he was doing is radically unethical. I mean, he was basically using his media contacts to track down various people who were accusing his brother of sexual assault. That is astonishing. Like, you can't use your media sources in order to help the hatchet woman, DeRosa, who works for Cuomo, basically his top aide, to image management, or crisis management, basically. It's way beyond the pale.
The allegation, and this was released on Monday by Letitia James, who again, of course, is the Attorney General for New York, who has been doing a lot of the stuff relating to Andrew Cuomo, from the sexual assaults, which had been, I think, burbling. Some of these accusations against Andrew Cuomo had been made a long time ago, but it wasn't until Letitia James started to release her reports, first on the nursing home deaths and then on the sexual assaults, that this stuff started to blow up. So my point is, same person, so arguably sort of part of the same narrative here. And I will come back to that at some point, probably with Ted, but just her, because it's interesting, especially with her running for governor. But with Chris, it's like you said, DeRosa had contacted Chris Cuomo trying to get him to figure out, okay, we hear that there's going to be a negative article coming out about Andrew in Politico, basically. I think that was the outlet. Yeah. Basically having Chris track that person down, figure out if that's true or not. And that's where it ends. But then the question comes, what next? What is he says on it. That's all. It's just like he's a taskmaster or whatever for me, or taking tasks from her. He'll do what she wants him to do. So he goes out, he's working on that. What comes next? What does he do with that contact? Does he talk to them? Does he get them to stop writing that? Does he figure out what they're going to be writing and give that info to his brother's campaign, his brother's office, so that they can anticipate that and come up with a calculated response? Whatever the case may be, that's clearly past advisory work, and that's into like, wow, you're doing active behind the scenes diplomatic espionage stuff.
Yeah,
for his optics, for his PR. Exactly, reconnaissance, recon work. That's a good way to put it. It's weird, man.
I mean, and to your point, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? Like, say for the moment that you are able to track down that person. Say, it's this woman accused them at the party of kissing her on the lips. Okay, I'm on it, DeRosa. I'm gonna use my media contacts as Chris Cuomo at CNN, trusted name in news, to go and find out who that person is. Why? Why are you finding out who that person is? I mean, what are you trying to do? Are you trying to jog his memory in regards to, okay, wait a minute, did I really do this? You don't remember if you kissed somebody on the lips or not? How many people have you been doing this to? Have you been groping where you don't necessarily know who this person was at the party? And more importantly, even if they did give you that information, what are you doing with the data? I think it's that part. Like, why are you trying to track down these various people? To what end? Is it just so you know who they are? Or is it something that you're trying to be actionable about? Both of those scenarios are bad and problematic, to put it mildly. Both of those are problematic. Nobody else would be in a position to do that. But Cuomo, at his position at CNN, you would imagine they have all sorts of sources. He has all sorts of name recognition. He has all sorts of power, I would imagine, within that organization. And I would imagine he has all sorts of sources and contacts. I mean, the political story, he knew about what days. He was like, a rumor is coming out, that this story is coming out in several days. Okay, yep. Who's telling you that? How do you know that? You're basically getting inside information on stories for your brother in order to help him mitigate, let's say, the fallout from those particular stories, let alone potentially, and this is not necessarily in evidence, but again, the question becomes, why are you trying to do this? Potentially contacting and undermining and preempting that story. I mean, otherwise, why are you doing it? Like, is it purely just, okay, well, we just want to know what's coming ahead so we can get ahead of it and we can frame it correctly and everything else? Or is it something more nefarious? And I got to be honest, we don't necessarily know which one. But either way, it looks bad. And CNN had to respond. And so CNN's response was to put him on the bench. If this was anybody else, do you think they would have fired him? If this was like an intern, would they have cut that person?
Oh, you mean are they cutting him just because he's the brother of Andrew Cuomo and he's a big albatross around their neck, that kind of thing? If somebody did this, let's say somebody else did this that wasn't named Chris Cuomo, would they have been allowed to stay on set? I guess my point is... Oh, would they have been allowed to... I thought you were talking about the timing of the firing. Yeah, no, I don't. I mean, probably not. But I also do get the sense that Chris Cuomo, the Cuomo family is increasingly dead weight at this point. It's not like Andrew Cuomo's the governor anymore. It's not like Chris Cuomo has that as his as political cachet or something like that to justify his identity at CNN, if that makes sense. That's another way of looking at it, is that Andrew Cuomo didn't just benefit from having Chris as his newscaster brother who could help him pull strings, whatever. Chris, of course, benefited from having Andrew and Mario as family, of course. And so with Andrew on the outs, I don't doubt that there's something going on at CNN where it's like, well, this guy doesn't have the connections he used to, and he has this weird shadow. But of course, that's all ignoring the actual facts of the case, which is pretty, they're pretty bad when you look at them, and it makes damn good sense for them to want to drop him. It's interesting to me. Another thing about this, though, is where's the indignation from the media after the laudatory treatment of him last year? It's like another one of these stories, and this is part of the angle that makes it interesting too. A lot of other angles, and clearly the deaths at the nursing homes, those are a big deal on their own grounds. But the idea that, wait, you guys played this man up. He literally got an Emmy. He literally got primetime TV awards and millions of books sold, that kind of thing. And you were wrong about him. And guess what? Your news outlets literally directly helped him, benefited him. Somebody working for you for a major news outlet did recon work for Cuomo to help image manage himself or whatever. You get my point. I'm not saying that's CNN's fault necessarily, but a case could be made that they weren't doing nearly enough journalistic jurisprudence or whatever on the back end to make sure they were playing by the rules. And maybe they let Cuomo do what he wanted to because they figured it was a good story and it was a good way to get views. That's probably
what it was. Yeah. I mean, and yeah, CNN is culpable on some level in this too. I mean, they knew full well when they brought on Chris Cuomo and Andrew Cuomo for those, skits or whatever these guys were doing, they were just kind of hamming it up, that was somewhat improper. I mean, like, because in a situation, how can you ever really bring your brother on and hit him on something that he might be doing in New York? I mean, the moment that the story turned, well, he never had his brother back on again at that point. It's like, but you've already given him all this publicity. You've already given him all this credit. You've bumped up his name recognition. I mean, granted, he's governor, so fair enough. But from the standpoint of the Emmy and everything else, you basically assisted your brother get all of this positive news coverage and everything else. Yeah, CNN knew exactly what they were doing when they were doing it. They were doing it particularly for views. And so now they're kind of in this quagmire, this ethical thicket that these guys are now in trying to navigate. So we'll see. I don't know if he's going to keep his job or not, but clearly this is greatly problematic. But let's do this. Yeah. Let's take a break. We'll be right back. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Radio Sputnik.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
Like beer? Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want them recorded.
Let's talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys find yourself in the D.C. area, you can always catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also kicking around in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. And I want to continue with the ethical, dubious Chris Cuomo. And I want to get into this conversation about Chris Cuomo and his brother, Andrew Cuomo. So, as we were mentioning, on Monday, Letitia James released a cache of transcripts and exhibits basically showing that Chris Cuomo's role in assisting his brother was far more extensive than Chris Cuomo originally stated. Of course, Andrew Cuomo is Chris's brother, and Chris is head of, well, he's not head, but he runs his own show on CNN, pretty famous mainstream show. And in this particular situation, as Andrew Cuomo, fate has found him, let's say, lacking, per se. He ends up in a situation with all of these people who basically died on his watch. He hid the number of those deaths. And on top of hiding those deaths, he had all of these sexual harassment suits and allegations against him. It basically undermined his governorship. But the last few months, as his governorship was basically torching itself, well, you have Chris Cuomo, his brother, newsman Chris Cuomo, who seems to have taken a pretty big role in helping his brother. To call this ethically dubious is a massive, massive understatement. Chris Cuomo was actively in touch with Cuomo's brother, top aide Melissa DeRosa, this was basically his hatchet woman, using his own media contacts and his own stature at the network to track down accusers to get ahead of damaging stories and to get ahead of damaging stories that are coming out. As we mentioned, the political story, for example, saying, hey, there's a rumor that this story is coming out in a few days. Or in the other case where Rosa would text them back and forth. These guys were in active communication with one another in order to basically plan and strategize, not to mention again, to frame certain stories for this kind of public relations or public management of damage control. That's what Chris Cuomo was basically doing in his perch at CNN. Yes, that is problematic ethically, to put it mildly. Why are you using your media contacts in order to get your brother or mitigate the damage that your brother is dealing with? Why are you using your media contacts to mitigate the damage that your brother is going through? I mean, is that really part of your job? And considering that you're a newsman and you're facing the front and you're the one who's giving the public information and everything else, and the public is supposedly turning to you to trust your opinion, your decisions, and everything else, can those decisions be trusted upon when it seems that you're adding so much attention and interest in your brother? Yeah, it's problematic. Chris Cuomo himself mentioned that it was a problem. But in the first iteration of his story, he basically said, I listened to my brother and I basically would give him advice. That was the first iteration. That was his first story. Now, he did say it was a mistake because I put my colleagues here, who I believe are the best in the business, in a bad spot. I never intended for that. I would never intend for that. And I am sorry for that. He said that back in May. But the problem is, again, it went far, far beyond that, where he was basically lying to his audience and, in this case, potentially, depending upon what CNN knew, even lying to CNN. Andrew Cuomo, his brother, was not happy with Letitia James doing this. He, of course, shaking his fist at her, basically saying this is a political hatchet job and that she is trying to do this in order to feather her nest in order to run for governor. That's irrelevant to whether she's doing it or not. Let's say for the moment she is. That has zero to do with Chris Cuomo on his perch, using his perch and using his stature at that network in order to benefit his brother. It is problematic. Don't get me wrong, I do get that it's your brother and you want to do something, you want to help your brother. And you probably can frame this in a way where you're listening to your brother and you're like, oh man, that's rough. I'm here for moral support and everything else. But the moment you start using media contacts, the moment that you start using your position at CNN in order to out or try to find out who certain people are, certain accusers are, and to track those people down or to get ahead of stories and everything else, you're basically leveraging your news position to get your brother out of hot water that is in a political situation. It's improper, to put it mildly. CNN has basically suspended Cuomo pending further investigation. They made a statement. The New York Attorney General's office released transcripts and exhibits on Monday that shed light on Chris Cuomo's involvement and his brother's defense. The documents, which were not privy to before their public release, raised serious questions. When Chris admitted to us that he had offered advice to his brother's staff, he broke our rules and we acknowledged that publicly. But we also appreciated the unique position he was in and we understood his need to put family first and jobs second. However, these documents point to a greater level of involvement in his brother's efforts than we previously knew. As a result, we have suspended Chris indefinitely pending further evaluation. Look, whatever you want to think about it, is it really Chris Cuomo's job to work with Andrew Cuomo's hatchet woman, his top aide, DeRosa, in order to save his brother? And if you want to do that in your personal time, fair enough. But should you be leveraging your media position to do that? And of course, the answer to that is basically no. Not only does it breach ethical guidelines, it's even against CNN's own rules. And so, yeah, that's problematic, to put it mildly. And the question becomes, is Cuomo going to be able to keep his job after this? People thought that Cuomo went too far the first time around, meaning the admission that he gave the first time around, even though it was perfectly understandable, okay, he's listening to his brother, he's giving his brother advice, they thought that was too far, and they thought he should have been fired for that. You add this into it, where he's basically using his position to undermine or go after some of the witnesses that are basically testifying against his brother, or for that matter, using the news to get ahead of those stories. Yeah, it gets that much more worse, or that much worse. However, there is somebody who's standing in Chris Cuomo's corner, a friend of his who wants the best for Chris. And we have the one and only bro from another mother, Don Lemon. Don Lemon. So Don Lemon had some good words for Chris Cuomo yesterday. Let's play this clip.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you, brother.
I know you had a great Thanksgiving. I hope you did. I missed you. I'm grateful for your friendship and your love. I think that you are fantastic. One of the kindest people I know on this planet. There you go. I meant every word.
Well, I am thankful for you in my life. It was great to see you having a good time.
Shane, one of the kindest people he knows on this planet. One of the kindest people he knows on this planet. I think Don Lemon needs to know more people, personally.
I think he sounds like he's about to execute him or something. It sounds like he's about to mercy kill him, and he's like complimenting or something. There's something weird about it. I don't know, but isn't that kind of what's happening here in some sense? And that's why my mind goes to it. Is he's saying
he knows
goodbye.
He's in trouble. I think that's what it is.
Yeah, he knows. I love you, man. It was great knowing you, and it was a great time. And
right.
Or some, you know what I mean? Something like that. There's that attitude in it. Yeah, that's what I had. That clip is insane, man.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, my uncle used to live across the street from my grandmother's house. And my uncle had several kids, and he used to have adopted kids also. And every so often, when the kids did something wrong, and you knew they did something wrong, and you knew they were in trouble, and they were going to get the belt, and they would just be standing outside, and it's like this dead man walking feel, where my mom said, don't say anything to him. just let them be. They're going to have a bad day at this point. That's kind of how this feels. It's this, what Lemon is like, all right, I need to give him an ego up boost because I know he's going through it right now. And look, he didn't bring it up during the show, and they didn't necessarily delve into it for, I suppose, obvious reasons. But yeah, Don Lemon is like, I love you, man. I love you, man. But yeah, Don, I appreciate Don looking out for him. That's
and Cuomo, the elder Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo's point through his spokesperson after stepping down, and this whole thing is passed basically. Mm-hmm. But as these reports from James come out, his tactics continue to be, this was politicized. Letitia James had intended to run for governor. She executed this all to push me out, whatever. And I agree with him that is 100%. That seems like the case, is that Letitia James did want to run for governor. She did see all this stuff. She did put these reports together. She did get them out. But that's in some sense beside the point. I don't care what she could be a devil, or she could be the worst person in the world or whatever. If she's doing good work in the role or whatever in her office, in some sense, if New Yorkers see that, then they're going to care more about that probably than they will about Andrew Cuomo when they found out everything that he's done. It doesn't matter why she's doing it. The fact is, she came out with these facts. She did the research, and it doesn't look good for anybody. But I think that angle of it, it's not to tear down the reporting or anything. It's just worth keeping in mind, because why did this newest thing come out on Monday? Ultimately, maybe they were just trying to clean up any loose ends. But another angle that comes to mind is they knew going up against Cuomo, Letitia James running for governor, her office knew they would stand a better chance if Andrew Cuomo didn't have a friend in the media. And it's as realpolitik as that, in my opinion. That's one way of looking at it. And again, another way of looking at it, the good faith way is, where you don't think of her as a savvy political figure, is, she did this because they saw evidence of irresponsible professional behavior by the younger Cuomo brother, and they wanted to make sure the public knew about it. That's one interpretation, but I'm not going to, I'm going to see it politically as well. She's clearly running for governor, and she's sort of making these strategic moves in anticipation of that run,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, even if you want to take the most politically craven point of view, it doesn't matter one iota. I mean, it's like, look, Because she could have been licking her lips when she found out that he had been hiding the number of people that he killed in New York. She could have been licking her lips. All of it still was true. And so it doesn't really matter. I mean, even in the sense of his brother, yes, she could be going after your brother, maybe, maybe not. But again, even if it's true, even if you take the worst view of it, it doesn't really matter. He actually did do that stuff. So
it's just as damning for him.
Yeah.
It's just as bad for him. And that's the point. I can see it. And I kind of, that's my tailored anticipated response or something to the opposite argument, which is, well, this is just a campaign of hers to get him out. Well, but did he do it? You know, did she make anything up? Did she fabricate anything? Because if not, then it all still applies, of course.
Absolutely. 1,000% true. Absolutely. Yeah. This looks bad for him. I guess the question becomes, is he going to be able to keep his job? We can talk to Ted about it. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune in to Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So we were having this conversation about Chris Cuomo, and I want to continue this conversation with Chris Cuomo. I want to bring in our guest, Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted, how's it going, my man? Doing okay this morning?
I'm probably having a better morning than Chris. How about you?
Most people are having a better morning than Chris. Yeah. Yeah, right? Yeah, that doesn't look good for him. What are your thoughts about this? I mean, when he initially said, look, well, let me ask it this way. When he initially came out and CNN revealed that, okay, yeah, he was giving his brother advice, not this extensive, but just giving his brother advice. Did you think that was beyond the pale, even back then? Or did you think, no, that's understandable. It's his brother. Of course, he's going to help his brother out. You know, it's a faux pas, but I get it. Or how did you view that first time around?
First time around, I thought it was way beyond the pale. CNN should never have, well, they should have let him go immediately. The truth is, the conflict of interest was baked in from the start by the fact that he was the governor's brother in the first place. He just shouldn't have been hired just on looks alone, because when it comes to conflict of interest in journalism, appearances and reality are exactly the same. Even if he's estranged from his brother and is never talking to him, it looks bad. And the viewers on a news station have the right to believe that everything is on the up and up, and they're not going to believe that.
Yeah, I think they're probably going to have a hard time with that. I don't know if they I mean, man, that's a tough one. I mean, I don't think just because this is his brother, he shouldn't have gotten the job, but definitely there are problems with him covering anything to do with, well, maybe you're right. I mean, because there's problems covering anything to do with the governorship at that point. And if you're in New York, how could you not cover the governor? I mean, so I feel you on that one. What do you think, Shane?
I had to get my mute off. I have a weird problem with political dynasties in general, and so anything you can do to get those makes sense, including, okay, if one branch of the family is in politics, the other branch, you might not want to give them such a warm welcome in the media, even though there's a draw. But of course, we were just talking about this a couple minutes ago, Jamarl. Why did they hire Chris? Because his brother's Andrew. And with his brother no longer being governor, there's probably not nearly as much of a draw for him. And that might help to explain the latest bout, although, of course, James's release on Monday fully explains it. Ted, that's another angle on this. Why do you think they, just clearly, to be clear about it, why do you think they hired him in the first place? Was it primarily because of his family connections? And why do you think they dropped him now? Is there anything behind the James release, behind the timing here? And then James' political career is another sort of topic to come back to. But Ted, what's your take?
Well, there's a word that we can't say on radio that, starts with star and then ends with, and then goes to the letter F and then ends with ing. That's what was happening when Chris Cuomo was hired by CNN. I mean, he have strong journalistic bona fides. They knew that it was a name that viewers would recognize. And I mean, they hired him because of the conflict of interest, in a sense. I mean, that's what's so gross about it. And, I guess you could say, okay, well, there's examples of, celebrity-based journalism, like, I think of Ronan Farrow, for example, where they actually are talented, they actually do a good job. But it's such a big world. If your relative is a top politico, then quite frankly, you shouldn't be hired for a high-profile journalism job, unless maybe, if Chris Cuomo had worked his way up from the Birmingham News to, the Memphis paper, and eventually made his way through journalism up to the highest ranks of CNN. That might be different, but to just be plucked out and elevated that way, it's gross.
Yeah.
It's a practice that should just not be allowed.
So what do you think happens here? I mean, do you think they're going to get rid of him? I mean, apparently Cuomo's show is one of the most, I guess, the one that brings in the viewers more than many of the other shows on CNN. And maybe, and I'm not saying that because that should matter, but I'm saying that because it does matter in the way that CNN frames us. Their business, their job is to maximize profit in some level. What do you think happens from here on out?
Yeah, people have been making comparisons to what happened over on NBC when the former host, was caught fibbing about war, Brian Williams.
Brian, yeah.
And then they ended up giving him a, somewhat like a low-profile soft landing at 11 p.m. Over on the cable side on MSNBC. That's not going to happen here. I don't think we're ever going to see Chris Cuomo on the airwaves ever again, except perhaps on a Sunday morning panel from time to time, like sort of the way Chris Christie has been rehabilitated on ABC. I think that's about it. I don't think he's ever going to have his own show. I certainly don't think he'll be back on CNN, and I don't see MSNBC making space for him either.
Yeah, I don't get the feeling MSNBC is going to make space for him. That's interesting. I don't know. What do you think, Shane?
And so goes the Cuomo family, probably, because, of course, you have the three. There was Mario, Andrew, and Chris. Those are at least the ones that I know. I'm sure they had parents who were notable in their own ways. But there's just, maybe going back into it for a second, reading through some of the deeper history. Real quick, I just want to pause on the family. Was Mario Cuomo, the word is, like, he was the mob governor. That is what I was reading.
I've heard that.
It's true. It's just that he had a bunch of connections, that he was deeply tied in, and that sort of sets up an understanding for the family environment for Chris and Andrew. I just coming back to it, it's an interesting angle for me personally. Is that true? Was he the mob governor or something like that? Again, I don't know too much about the state, but I've heard that. Ted.
I was I lived in the state at that time. I was active in Democratic Party politics at that time. And the truth is no one really knows. I think probably there were always rumors that there was some kind of mob tie, but there was never any sense that Mario himself had dirty hands. So it might have been someone close to him, but not him personally benefiting. He was really a top presidential contender for a long time. He didn't run, but he always toyed with it. He was one of those guys people were like really hoping he would be the great New York gubernatorial hope. He was kind of a colossus compared to the personality of his two sons. And it's really the apples have rolled pretty far away from the tree. I think the fact that it's been so long and no historian has ever or journalist has ever been able to really pin anything on Mario makes me think there probably wasn't a lot there.
It was just rumors mostly. That makes sense. I'm just trying to get a sense for what was going on in the heads, if that makes sense, because it seems like the end of the dynasty at this point.
Yeah, it does. I mean, look, they have plenty of money. They have apparently at least one of them has a nice boat out in Sag Harbor. So they're not going to starve to death or anything like that. But I think that there's going to have to be at bare minimum a 5-year traditional American lying low kind of period and perhaps writing a book before there can be anything that sort of looks like a traditional post-political rehabilitation. But
that necessary, like, penitent period where you're sort of, hoping that the public forgives you for your sins out in public, very publicly. When you choose to get public with a book, otherwise you're just sort of staying laying low, right, Ted?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, I think the thing is, Andrew in particular was really hated and reviled, though. To know him was to dislike him. So there's, no one really is eager to see him ever crawl back from under whatever rock he's hanging out in right now. So, as for Chris, I mean, Chris is a more likable sort. But I don't think I think we'll see Chris before we see Andrew.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, we're going to see what happens. CNN has to do something at this point. I mean, suspending him is probably going to be the least of it. I want to jump to one of the things that's taking place in New York, the Maxwell trial. What is it like there? Is there somewhat of a media circus around this particular trial? I know that they don't have cameras in the room. I think they should have cameras in the room. But what's your take on that? I mean, I was looking at some of the testimony that took place. 14-year-old girl basically gave testimony. She's older now. She's an adult. But she basically talks about this kind of grooming that took place when she was very young. Like, okay, I have a dog. I'm petting the dog. Hey, you're from Florida? Hey, I'm from Florida. What's your phone number? And keep in mind, this is like a 14-year-old. And they're basically showing how Maxwell was working to groom these women, well, these children at this point, for Epstein. Like, it's some pretty rough testimony to go over. What are your thoughts about this trial so far?
Well, it's not a New York story, even though the events took place in New York, and obviously the trial is in New York, and the figures involved were in New York. I mean, New York is the nation's largest city. It's the media capital, and a lot of stuff goes on here that is really a national story. Right. I think this is one of them. New Yorkers don't view this as something that only could happen here, like, let's say, the Joey Buttafuoco trial or something. To take you back down memory lane. This is viewed as a big national story. A lot of New Yorkers I talk to keep waiting to see if the other shoe is going to drop on, former presidents, who wrote on the...
like Bill Clinton, Trump. I mean, Prince Andrew is one of the people who was implicated, Bill Richardson. I mean, there's so many people, so many connections.
Yeah, I mean, especially Bill Clinton. He flew on it a lot. I think with Trump, it was just a few times. So, I think it's sort of just like, the dogs, the noses are sort of sniffing around and like, well, what about Bill? How come, this is going to lead to anything with him? I mean, I don't think yet, but, this is, it's obviously a very disturbing story and sad and horrible, and a lot of people here still talk about Epstein's death. And it's kind of an article of faith among at least the chattering classes in the media that he was probably murdered.
Yeah, that's what look, I've said it before. I think he was whacked. Either one or two things. Either they allowed him enough space to off himself, or somebody did it. I mean, even the gentleman, well, I can't think of the guy's name, but the cop with the huge arms, the one who had bodies buried in his backyard. I mean, that guy had a cell phone in his own thing. Epstein wakes up on the floor, apparently, roughed up. The guy said, well, he tried to kill himself silently. I was asleep. I didn't wake up while he was trying to kill himself. And then you have this thing where they put him in a cell that people are supposed to monitor him every so hours. The guards went to sleep, both. The video cameras didn't work. I mean, it's like any and everything that could go wrong in that jail in order to get Epstein to no longer live went wrong. I mean, it seems too coincidental. I mean, yes, I guess they could be radically incompetent, but there's no reason for me to believe that they were just radically incompetent. And if they were radically incompetent in one sense, is it possible that somebody could have gotten that jail to off him? I think so, yes.
I have a friend who has served, he served 3 years in the same facility. And when this happened, he shouted up and down at the bar where we were at that there was absolutely no way that anybody there wasn't checked every 8 minutes. Forget about
yeah.
He said every single inmate was repeatedly checked. And he said the idea that there could be a single camera that wouldn't be working for more than a couple of minutes was just a farce. That's just impossible. That just couldn't have happened. Wouldn't have happened. So, there were so many tales of like he was unattended for hours at a time.
Mm-hmm.
Just like, give me a break.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense. Hasn't made any sense. That's why the memes exist. That's why everybody's been saying this kind of. I say everybody, and it's obviously I'm being hyperbolic, but that's why, of course, this has been the dominant narrative, sort of subcultural thread going through this whole thing. Was that he knew stuff. People didn't want him to talk. They killed him. Epstein didn't kill himself. Of course, that's become the thing. Real briefly, I just want to go back because Jeffrey Epstein, a lot of this is about him, but Ghislaine as a figure, in some way, it doesn't make sense to me that she's the person, but she's not a completely anonymous figure. She had a family, obviously. Her father, the elder Maxwell, big media tycoon, actually built a super yacht, which he named after her, the Lady Ghislaine, that was originally built for like a Saudi emirate or something like this, a Saudi member of the Saudi royal family, then sold to Robert Maxwell, her father, who named it Lady Ghislaine, now in the possession of Rupert Murdoch's ex-wife, Anna Murdoch, which kind of irrelevant, but it's just she was a figure of this sort of, I don't know, nouveau riche kind of rising British transatlantic, a British American aristocracy kind of thing. Again, nouveau riche, not like old money, but it seems like she was this kind of part of this family, updraft of wealth. That's her environment, where when she's in the courtroom, I think it was last week, blowing kisses to her sister, despite being out for the world to see, basically, answering for charges of acting as a madame and child prostitution. The image doesn't match, but it's like she's in her own weird bubble, is my point with this stuff. She's kind of coming from that environment. So a weird figure, but I want to go to the New York side of this for a second. I do want to jump back to Jeffrey. Epstein was based in Florida about as much as he was based in New York, as far as I can tell. He had the big Manhattan apartment, the one that he got from Les Wexner for $1, literally $1. The sale price. He was in Florida for a lot of this stuff, but of course he had his New York connections too. I think that was where he first came up, working as a math tutor before he started to get this weird sort of private net of funding. Do you think, Ted, New Yorkers see this as their story? I know that you said with Ghislaine it's a national thing and to some extent an international thing, but with Jeffrey Epstein, I think of Florida, but I also think of New York. Do you think New Yorkers see that in a similar way?
Well, I mean, sort of in the fact that if you happen to be on that block where Epstein and Ghislaine lived on the Upper East Side, and you see the journal, you'll see a few cameras and paparazzi sort of permanently camped out there with, an NYPD cruiser parked there. You'll be like, oh wait, what? Oh yeah, this is it. I remember what this is about. So there's that. But I think those people have always been sort of, they cruise the streets in limousines, right? I mean, they're not ordinary New Yorkers. They live in a different world. You mentioned the bubble. They're in a permanent bubble. When you were saying that, I will say just personally, I felt like a little bit of sympathy for her, and I don't know if it's because this is gender. I'm a guy and she's a woman, but there was sort of the fact that her guy, they killed him or let him be killed or let him commit suicide, and now they're putting her on trial. The whole thing just feels kind of churlish. I mean, it's kind of like you got rid. You had a good defendant.
Right. I mean, it was like, that's the guy. Why are you guys coming after me? Yeah, I feel you on that. But I guess the issue, though, yeah, I can feel you on that. I mean, yeah, I think that's the male thing where it's like you kind of want to be defensive. However, in this particular situation, it seems like she was basically rearing and grooming children. I mean, literal children, not even, like 17. We're talking about like 14 years old. I can't imagine that. I mean, I look at what my relatives were at that age, and they're so young. Like, they still have baby fat, for that matter. I mean, if you understand what I mean, it just seems it's difficult. And if it's 3 or 4, how many of it they're going to use. I get the feeling there's probably a lot more that are there that they just didn't know of or weren't aware of. Also, a question is fair to ask. Would Epstein have been able to do it or be as effective without her?
No, it's disgusting.
Yeah,
I don't, and I can't even imagine. If that happened to my kid, I would just be, beyond, or to anyone I know. I mean, it's just it's insane. There's no other word but disgusting. But I just don't see, and I also don't even see the purpose of this trial. In that, like, we all know the outcome here.
Yeah.
There's no world in which she's found not guilty. And so it's kind of like, well, they didn't offer to plea her. I mean, and like, why is she even bothering to spend money on a defense? I mean, is she just trying to get a few years off her sentence? I don't get it. It seems like basically effectively a lifetime sentence is inevitable. Humiliation and a guilty verdict are inevitable. Like, why are we even doing this?
Yeah. Yeah, it does seem, I feel you. I mean, I have a hard time believing she's going to walk. I mean, Bill Cosby was able to get off on a technicality, but they're still going after Bill Cosby. In her case, she, at this point, has so much ire against her. It seems like it would be a difficult thing for her to get by on. One more thing before we leave. I wanted to get into the shutdown. I mean, there are two things. The Republicans are basically threatening to shut down the government over the vaccine mandates. Keep in mind, these mandates are still hung up in court. And if I'm not mistaken, OSHA basically got rid of them until they finished their court cases. But they are saying we're going to shut down the government over these mandates. And there's also this issue of the debt ceiling still looming. So the shutdown for the government, this needs to be done within a week, apparently, whereas the debt ceiling needs to be done by the 15th of December. It doesn't seem like they're on pace for any of this. And, for the standpoint of the debt ceiling, Joe Manchin came out and basically said, well, hey, we can use budget reconciliation in order to do this. Well, can you do that? If you're going to use budget reconciliation for this, well, what are you going to use for the Build Back Better plan? I mean, that's assuming they even pass the Build Back Better plan. It doesn't seem like you're going to be able to get 2 bites at the apple on that, meaning we're going to pass the BBB with budget reconciliation, and we're going to pass this other thing or to overcome the debt ceiling, also a budget reconciliation, basically using budget reconciliation 3 times within the course of a year. It doesn't seem like that's allowed. But tell me if I'm wrong on that.
Man, BBB feels like some of these projects I've had in development in Hollywood for years.
It does, right? It's been all year. I mean, it's been going all the way. And, when you think about it, there's something Shane said that I'm beginning to think Shane is probably right on. If you're going to spend a year talking about $3.5 trillion, and then you're going to get to the point where you can't get over the finish line, and not just can't get over the finish line, you start taking stuff away from it. And so you have all of these big policies that people loved. Oh, we're going to expand Medicare. Yeah, you're in the middle of a pandemic. That looks great. We're going to include vision and dental. Yeah, that looks great. We're in the middle of a pandemic. But then you start taking stuff away. Then what it seems like, you've been talking about something for basically 10 months. And whatever you started off as, you start chopping off limbs to the thing that people are concerned about. And the thing that people see is what's not in it, not what's in it, if that makes sense. It was like the debate and everything else has gone on for so long. It makes him seem as if he's weak. It makes him seem as if he can't get anything accomplished. On top of that, it makes him seem that the Democratic Party is somewhat divided on that, and that the president doesn't have any kind of power to get his agenda accomplished. And on top of that, it really comes across as if, well, you guys said you were going to do X, and now you've basically chopped this all the way down to, B, whatever, the end result is. Yeah, they seem to be taking a hit for that. I mean, if you're going to drop this to 1.7, you should have just went with 1.7 in the beginning. But of course, we know that if you would have did that, it would have been 200 billion or something that they would have been able to basically get over. That's assuming they get it over in the first place. I guess the question is, do you think they're even going to pass the BBB at this point?
I don't think it's going to pass this year, and I think if it passes in the spring or in the early, or I should say midwinter of next year, it's going to be. I think people have already stopped paying attention. Yeah. People are focused on Omicron now. That's what people are just absolutely terrified of. I think that's one place the Democrats could really drive a wedge between Republicans and their supporters on their opposition to vaccine mandates. It's like, well, we have this terrifying new variant coming. there are any mutations. I mean, nobody really knows what that means. Because he's not an epidemiologist, but apparently that's bad. And everyone's scared to death for what's coming. So this would be a good time if Democrats had good messaging, to, really truly drive to make the point that maybe, being anti-vax right now or anti-mandate is a little tone deaf. But, I don't think they're going to make that point. I don't know. This stuff isn't going to get done. And the only part that gives some room for hope is McConnell's been relatively quiet about it. It's kind of like, well, I made my point. I said I'm not going along. You guys are on your own for this. He hasn't said much lately.
Yeah.
So that, maybe there's room for optimism there for the Democrats, but they're, as usual, their own worst enemy.
Yeah, I got to be honest. It feels like the first time around when the debt ceiling thing came up with Obama, it's almost like you kind of build yourself up, right? It's like you have to get yourself the right mindset in order to kind of take that step. And in the beginning, it's like, okay, we're going to make this threat, but it's just the threat. We don't really believe it. And so during Obama's term, they eventually fall over themselves. Oh, we got to pass this. We can't let the government collapse, or we got to pay the bills and everything else. This time around, it doesn't feel that way. It feels like they've settled on this notion that, yeah, we're going to go over the ceiling. We're going to go over the cliff, and we're willing to accept it. And you have enough Republicans at this point that are probably true believers on this, that they're really willing to basically destroy the country, the full faith and credit of the United States for some kind of political gamesmanship. It's astonishing. Has this ever, I mean, you're a learned person in regards to politics and history or political history. Has there ever been a time like this? I mean, and I know that sounds weird because oftentimes we think, there's always this question, were people better in the past? But I don't remember a time where it seemed that the government itself was basically trying to eat the government, if that makes sense.
No, I don't think there's been, of course, obviously you can go to the Civil War, but I think there has, the episode that I'm reminded of is League of Nations. It was Woodrow Wilson's idea. It was, and after World War I, it just seemed like an obvious no-brainer. Even if you read high school history now, you're just like, well, that was going to happen. And then just out of just pure partisanship, Republicans just refused to ratify.
Yeah, they wouldn't allow it.
Membership in the organization that was the U.S.'s idea.
Right.
That had some bad results in the next 20 years. It didn't cause World War II, but it didn't help. And and that just was an embarrassment to national prestige at the time. Because it was like, wait, the entire world was told, hey, join this grand new American international organization. And wait, America's not part of it? So, that it kind of reminds me of that. I mean, American prestige really, suffered tremendously. And I would say even today, the UN doesn't have quite as much prestige because of that episode.
Yeah.
I
guess this feels worse to me. I mean, because it seems like everybody recognizes, okay, the debt limit is important. And if you screw with that, then you're talking about basically, the last time they were messing around with this, you had an increase in our interest rates that the United States basically had to pay going forward because they consider the government to be incompetent. It's like the government doesn't have the ability to do basic things. And so it's like now we're at this precipice where it seems like they're legitimately considering about going over. But Ted, thank you, my man. I really appreciate this. I always enjoy these conversations. The voice.
Me too.
Absolutely. The voice that you guys were listening to is Ted Rall. He's a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Of course, you can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall, and you can read his cartoons and articles at rall.com. I always say he's a learned man in history. Ted Rall can bring up things that took place in the 1800s and everything else. The man is phenomenal. All right, guys, you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the radically independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means, more likely than not, you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Right on, starting off the show with a really good conversation with Ted. All right, let's get into the headlines. In the news, yesterday in the United States, there were 216,312 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,876 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 83,365 cases per day, an increase of 3% from the average 2 weeks ago. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 70% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 48,195,182 people across the United States and has killed an unfortunate 777,417 men, women, and children in America. Top U.S. government officials are considering requiring everyone who enters the country to be tested for COVID-19 the day before the flight and having all travelers, including U.S. citizens and permanent residents, be tested again after returning home, regardless of the vaccination status. Officials were deliberating the potential change Tuesday night, and no final decisions have been made, but the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention confirmed in a statement that the agency is working to revise testing requirements for travelers because of the new Omicron variant. Gotta be honest, it should have been that way anyway. In national news, a 15-year-old boy is in custody after 3 students died and 8 were injured in a shooting Tuesday night or Tuesday afternoon at a high school in Oxford, Michigan, authorities say. The Oxford high school students killed were a 16-year-old boy, a 14-year-old girl, and a 17-year-old girl, Oakland County Undersheriff Michael G. McCabe said at a news conference. Also in national news, CNN is suspending primetime anchor Chris Cuomo indefinitely pending further evaluation after new documents revealed a cozy and improper nature of his relationship with aides to his brother, former Governor Andrew Cuomo. Those documents were released Monday by New York Attorney General Letitia James. Andrew Cuomo was very upset about this, making the point that he believes this is still political gamesmanship, that she's basically trying to feather her nest for governorship. By the same token, it's somewhat irrelevant. His brother actually did that stuff. A woman who testified Tuesday in a sex trafficking trial of Ghislaine Maxwell said she met a close confidant of Jeffrey Epstein and a billionaire businessman when she was 14 years old and eating ice cream with friends at a camp where he was a benefactor. Jane, quote unquote, described in graphic detail incidents of sexual abuse with Epstein and Maxwell would at times join in on, both in Palm Beach, Florida, and Manhattan when she was 14, 15, and 16 years old. Investigators in New Mexico were authorized by a state judge Tuesday to search an Albuquerque prop store where some of the rounds used on the set of the film Rust prior to the fatal shooting in October are believed to have been supplied. Of course, this is Baldwin when he basically shot the person. Supposedly, it's an accident. They're doing an investigation at this point. But the question became, how did they get live rounds into this particular gun that was supposed to be a prop gun, killing one person and maiming another? In international news, Tel Aviv, Israel, has been named the most expensive city for living for the first time in a new survey conducted by the Economist Intelligence Unit. In holiday news, we have Universal Human Rights Month, Worldwide Food Safety Month, or Service Safety Month, bifocals at the Monitor Liberation Day, Commemoration Day, Eat a Red Apple Day, and Kazakhstan's first President's Day. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Very interesting. I love the fact that they have days, I swear, for pretty much everything. And I keep saying that when you have a day for pretty much everything, it kind of undermines the very point of having a day in the first place. But
dude, we have like 20 holidays today. And
I know,
I'm not
right?
kidding. Like there are like a total of, you can see every hour we're going through a different batch, and there are like 7 per batch, and it's not good. Jamarl, we have holiday inflation.
Yeah, holiday inflation. I love that. Holiday inflation. Exactly. There's another story that's been developing that's getting pretty hairy, to put it mildly. There's concern that, well, Putin has basically drawn a red line saying, do not send troops and do not send military into Ukraine. Because basically the United States and Western nations have been belly aching about this. Russia has troops on their own border, right? It's on their side of it. And yet the United States and many of its Western allies have basically been belly aching about this stuff, including to the point of potentially getting NATO involved. Putin has basically said he will request talks with NATO to ensure that the U.S.-led military bloc does not creep any closer to his country's borders as Ukraine moves to allow Western troops into the country. That's a red line. That's a severe red line. It's weird that we don't understand that. I mean, the United States was willing to basically end the world over the Cuban Missile Crisis with the thought that we don't want those missiles this close to our home territory in Cuba. Now, we tried to murder Castro multiple times. Castro basically did what he needed to do to work with Khrushchev in order to try to secure his own station. This basically created this kind of event of this Cuban Missile Crisis where we were trying to prevent them. We did not know at the time that those weapons or those missiles were already there. And if there were any attacks on Cuba, those missiles would have been launched. I guess my point is, we understood it then when it was us in the crosshairs. But for whatever particular reason, we don't quite get this when we're talking about other countries and their want to be able to secure their borders. And let's keep in mind, Russia has been invaded multiple times. So it's not like, they're itchy about their borders for good reason. You're talking about 10, 20 million in one, and it was like 20, 30 million in one of the other ones. I mean, the numbers are astonishing. And yet, it's something where we're continuing a bellicosity around. This looks bad. I mean, this looks really bad. Apparently, there's supposed to be a conversation taking place between Biden and Putin coming up in December. But again, they had one earlier, and it still came to where we are now. What are your thoughts?
I thought a couple of things. For one thing, if more Americans knew more about this topic, as with so many topics, they probably have different opinions about what the United States does in regarding to it. And when it comes to Russia, the propaganda about Russia since the fall of the Soviet Union specifically has to do with the sort of resumption of tensions. I believe 2012, 2013, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you can see this. I would target specifically both the Euromaidan and the Syrian civil war. Yeah. Those are our 2 main proxy conflicts right now with Russia. Those both started, specifically our sort of involvement in back and forth with Russia. Those started right around that period, during the Obama administration, during the pivot to Asia, where there was simultaneously, as far as I can tell, a pushback from the Clintonite camp when she was Secretary of State, and other sort of associated parts of the neocon wing to no, it's not just China. We're still against Russia, right, guys? Something like that. That's an oversimplification of it, admittedly, but that probably gets across some of the territory that people might not necessarily be familiar with. So thought one is, if more Americans knew about what happened, which is there was an American foreign policy turn against Putin, basically, around the 2013 period, where we started to get more tense with them. We did a coup in Ukraine, a Western-backed coup, where literally recordings that anybody can play on YouTube, publicly accessible, where we're choosing the next governor, the next president of Ukraine. We're talking about who should be in what position. Our government, controlling their government, basically. That was us. ISIS, clearly, a lot of people have in the back of their mind the sense that the United States has done weird stuff supporting terrorists. Well, yeah, we supported ISIS. If you go and look at it, we were supporting the groups everybody thought we were fighting in Syria when it suited our interests, as a sort of theater in a theater of war in our long-term conflict against Russia. If more people knew about those things, it would reframe whatever thoughts they might have going into some outright conflict with Russia over Ukraine, which is what it seems some people in the White House and in the Pentagon and State Department want to get us into. So that was thought one. Thought two is, and I think it's worth making, Ukraine isn't a particularly valuable territory for Russia to take. If the West looks plainly at Russia's interest in Ukraine, it's largely cultural and historical, as far as I can tell. And certainly going forward geopolitically, it is a chess piece. It is a vacant. I mean, it's a vacant spot.
Yeah,
it's a border.
Right.
But the point is, it's not a territory that Russia deems extremely valuable to annex for economic reasons, and it's not one that they've. If you look at it, it's not like they were, gunning for Ukraine. It's not like that's been a thing. Honestly, the whole 2013 Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic breakaway thing. From conversations we've had, Russia kind of begrudgingly took them under its wing. It's like, okay, you guys are broke. I see what's going on there, and okay, we'll work with you. But for one thing, it's not a huge amount of territory. And for another thing, Ukraine, the poorest country in Europe, is a burden for any country, whether it's Russia or the United States or the European Union as a conglomerate. It's a burden to try to help that situation. It's not the kind of thing where it's a valuable investment property. In other words, if you look at what's actually going on here in Ukraine, you'll see the narrative the media in the West is sort of tacitly trying to paint that Russia is agitating for a war of aggression, and they never really spell out exactly why. It doesn't make any sense, and it falls completely apart.
No,
and more people knew that.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense at all. I mean, yeah, I agree with you. And just to add the other point that it's, like you said, it's somewhat of a chess piece or geopolitical chess piece. I mean, the issue is securing your borders and having the Ukraine being this kind of entry point into Russia for some kind of attack or some kind of preemptive attack. And any country, any country that has some level of sovereignty is going to want to secure their borders. That's just kind of is what it is, especially when you have a hostile group or a hostile organization that is created specifically to undermine you or to go after you. I mean, keep in mind, NATO wasn't supposed to expand at the point where I believe it was under Clinton or Bush. No, I'm sorry, it was under Bush. Clinton basically expanded NATO, despite the fact that they said they weren't going to expand it. And we've gotten to the point where we've gotten closer and closer, moving military armaments closer and closer to the point where they're on their borders. Right here. This is in the documents right here. Speaking to a group of newly arrived ambassadors in the Kremlin, Putin said his country will, quote, insist on guarantees being set out to exclude the possibility of NATO moving any further to the east and deploying threatening weapons close to Russian territory. I would like to emphasize the need for there need to be legal guarantees, the president said, given that our Western colleagues have not fulfilled their respective oral obligations. Everyone knows they made promises they wouldn't expand eastward, but they did the opposite. Legitimate Russian security concerns have been ignored and continue to be ignored. And I think that's the point. It's not so much that there's this craving, for Ukraine, like Russia's looking at Ukraine like Epstein looks at some 14-year-old. That's not it at all. I mean, this has everything to do with security and ensuring that the country is stable and safe from aggression. And in this case, the West has been basically amping it up. I mean, they even made the point of saying NATO's military infrastructure have basically advanced to the border. And if you know it for yourself, the United States keeps bringing this stuff up like, oh, they're going to attack Ukraine. They're thinking about attacking Ukraine. They're thinking about attacking Ukraine. Well, again, that seems to be more of a pretext for them to use it as a justification.
That's 100% what it is.
Yeah.
That's 100%. It's, again, the 2013 thing, that was a United States-backed coup. Yeah. And I don't doubt, it's not like everybody in the White House or everybody in the State Department necessarily knew that or knows that even now. What it seems happened was certain elements of Hillary Clinton's State Department, and again, a lot of this goes back to the Clintons, and it's not an accident. It's not, ooh, the boogeyman, the Clintons. There are reasons for it in terms of their contacts, I think, their history, why they would be doing these kinds of things, their ideology, their friends, their networks. It's another tangent that I admittedly want to learn more about, but from what I've seen, this is very much a them thing. Mm-hmm. Anyway, it seems like that under Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, the United States started to do these like digital uprising kind of events, teaching people civil activism. As a part of that, it seems very likely that we were involved in supporting other direct separatist movements in the Ukraine. And sort of, the nationalist Nazis that we bring up from time to time. And that when you combine all of this in a sort of panorama, you see the United States training people to do a revolution, training people in sort of various forms of civil disobedience. You see weird forms of support with Victoria Nuland going down the day of the revolution. Victoria Nuland, I believe Undersecretary of Affairs for the EU, in the State Department, but I need to go back. I believe that was her title at the time, but I need to go back and check her exact title. She's since been promoted. The point is, she's handing out cookies to the protesters. While the revolution is happening, basically, literally just like, okay, out there milling about in the streets, those are our point people. And this is the same Victoria Nuland who at another time is on a phone call with Jeffrey Piot, America's ambassador to Ukraine at the time, choosing who's going to be the next leader of the country.
Yeah.
And it's the same institution responsible for all these different ends of that. And then for pivoting to demonize Russia on the other side of it and make, okay, well, they're stepping in with Crimea and with the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, with those situations broadly, is a sign of their aggression. Well, no, it's not. We did this thing. We intentionally did this thing. And then when they step in to stabilize the situation, as we aggressively try to take, to move our pawn to that slot on the chessboard, they're stepping in to try to stabilize it. We paint as aggression. That is the narrative, as far as I can tell. And anyway, I'm sorry for going on a tangent about it, but
it's an aggravating narrative.
It's an aggravating narrative.
Yeah.
If you look at the history, isn't too complicated. You can go over it in 5 or 10 minutes, and once you see it, I haven't heard good rebuttals of it, and it's pretty clear to me. It's the kind of thing that if more people knew about it, and when they heard about this story, they would immediately their lie detector would go off, because they're like, no, that part's not true. That part's not true. That part's not true. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Look how they're doing it,
unfortunately.
Where yes, Trump pulled out of the deal. Trump killed the JCPOA. All of that stuff is true. Everybody understands it at this point. But the media will never necessarily talk about it like that. I mean, even Biden is like, well, we need to bring Iran back into compliance, as if the issue here is Iran. The issue is the U.S. Our media, man, the way they present the stuff gives a certain point of view to the public that they want. They're trying to elicit a very specific point of view by withholding certain information and giving others. All right, let's do this. Let's take a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be back with Peter Coffin, having a conversation about Jack Dorsey stepping down from Twitter and what is this going to mean for the company, for that matter. Why is he stepping down in the first place? Back shortly. Fault Lines, Thomas Stranahan.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys just so happen to find yourself in the D.C. area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So on Monday, Jack Dorsey, the CEO of, well, at the time, CEO of Twitter, puts out a tweet basically saying, I'm not sure if you guys have heard, but I no longer work at Twitter. Or I've resigned from Twitter. Now, this is pretty big. Jack Dorsey, as the CEO of Twitter, pretty much it's indistinguishable from what Twitter is. And so Jack Dorsey stepping down has all sorts of questions associated with why, for one, but also what is Twitter going to be after he leaves? In a weird twist on this, the moment that Dorsey basically said he was stepping down, you had employees saying, thankfully, we're no longer going to have a part-time CEO. And you had the stock price basically jump. Immediately after the stock price jumped, once they mentioned who was going to take over, CTO Parag Agrawal, the stock basically fell again. Now, this may have something to do with Parag basically being an insider, and they wanted new blood. Hard to know, but basically the stock went up, the stock went down. I think the question here, at least for everybody, especially people who basically use Twitter, is what is Twitter going to be without Jack Dorsey? To have a conversation about this, we're joined with Peter Coffin. Peter Coffin is a video essayist with over 250,000 YouTube subscribers, podcaster, and author. In their book, Custom Reality and You, They explore how reality works in a world where profit is the driving force. Relatable humor and a commitment to everyday people keeps their left perspective fresh, fun, and most importantly, sharp. Peter, welcome to the show, my man. How you doing today?
Good. How about yourself?
So far, so good. Ted Rawls said better than Chris Cuomo. So yeah, better than Chris Cuomo. Not too bad, actually.
Chris probably isn't having a great day.
Yeah, he's not having a great day at all. In fact, he's going to have a bad week, to put it mildly. But I want to get to the Jack Dorsey stepping down thing. What did you think about this? I mean, when I contacted you about this, you were excited about this because you were saying that he was basically saying some of the same things that you were saying or that was in your book. But what did you think about him stepping down? Why do you think he's stepping down? I guess it's probably the first question. And what is it going to mean for Twitter?
Well, I mean, first, I think one of the big things in terms of him just stepping down is what you hear from a lot of employees. He's kind of a part-time CEO. Like, he wasn't really regarded as like a guy who was there all the time. And then the new gentleman, Agarwal, he is, I mean, he's somebody who has been involved with a lot of decision-making. Apparently, he's been involved in almost every major decision that they've made over the last X number of years. I don't know exactly how many, but according to Dorsey, he's very instrumental in what they're doing. So I feel like, I mean, maybe he just figures that Agarwal is a good guy for, you know, a successor, and maybe it's time. Maybe he wants to go windsurfing. Oh, I don't know.
I mean, why do you think the stock dropped immediately? I mean, because like you said, the part-time CEO thing could be why the stock popped immediately when the person, you know, when they found out that he was stepping down. But why drop? I mean, when they found out that it was Agarwal, it basically collapsed. I mean, does this have to do with this kind of insider thing where they wanted some like new blood or new direction for Twitter? Like, what was the rationale behind that?
Well, I think that it's really interesting. I had looked into Indian media covering this because he's an Indian-born gentleman. He's got a degree from IIT Bombay, and they are celebrating this as though this is a huge national achievement on their media. And I'm wondering if that is somehow impacting how stock is being traded here. Like, did they think, hey, this is a guy who more or less the ship doesn't seem like it's going to go in any different direction, and maybe people wanted it to, and that's why the stock jumped. But on the other hand, it's also maybe, I don't want to say that this is like a big source of national pride or anything for investors, but I'm curious if they're thinking like of it as some kind of a threat. There's a large number of Indian-born folks that are getting very high positions at a lot of American companies lately. It's not just Twitter, but Twitter's an extremely high-profile one. I wonder if there's some kind of like weird underlying like threat to them if they feel that way. But I also think it's partly because, like, I think, as you said, you have an insider. You know, this part-time CEO thing. I think a lot of people were kind of hoping, oh, maybe they'll go in a different direction. And they probably won't go in a different direction because this gentleman, like I said, has been involved with a lot of the decisions for the last several years. It's reasonable to assume Twitter will probably operate very similarly in the near future and probably for as long as he's.
Well, yeah, and part of the narrative with Twitter, as a user, I can say this, but also as somebody who just kind of watched it for a long time, because Twitter is, in my opinion, one of the more interesting social media apps. Unlike Facebook, they did not expand into all these different sectors where you don't see, like, you know, years ago you had Farmville and all these Facebook games. Facebook was testing out different sort of ways of making money other than sheer advertising or you know, just their basics. Twitter didn't really do that. Twitter does these promoted tweets. They've added fleets. They've added different things over time. But for the most part, their bread and butter has been, and apparently always will be, especially with this pick, just Twitter, just doing their thing, which for investors, I'm sure they want them to make more money. They want to see aggressive growth. And I think the breath of fresh air thing with Twitter specifically, that was the idea was, hey, maybe we'll have a chance to see them do something new. And Agarwal is clearly not going to be doing that. He's you know, like you guys have been saying, he's been inside for so long that he's probably just going to keep that train rolling as it has been. I will bring up, though, on a sort of another, on the more political free speech side of a conversation, because of course Twitter's been doing a lot of suppressing of speech, like the other social media platforms. There are quotes going back from Agrawal. Some people were referencing really old tweets of his. There's a more recent one though from 2020, an interview that he did with the MIT Technology Review. I'll just quote from that here. Again, this is the new CEO of Twitter, Parag Agrawal, quote, "Our role is not to be bound by the First Amendment, but our role is to serve a healthy public conversation, and our moves are reflective of things that we believe lead to a healthier public conversation," end quote. Now, it would be easy, I can requote the first part, that's the attention-getting part. Our role is not to be bound by the First Amendment, quote unquote. That's what raises people's ears and kind of raises their eyebrows. But another way of looking at this is, it's the same complaint people have been making about Twitter for so long. They're trying to straddle this middle ground in terms of how they act. And of course, people make this complaint about the other social media companies too. Trying to straddle this middle ground, this gray zone between the whole platform publisher dichotomy and that dynamic where, okay, we'll censor some of your content, but not enough that we'll be held liable for everything that our users say. Trying to use the sort of their own version of strategic ambiguity to not get caught out like a deer in headlights by the government looking to reform them or something. But just reflecting on Dorsey for a second, and then I'll hand it back to you, Peter. Looking back, my main beef with Dorsey is I felt like he actually had a conceptual and even a moral understanding of the shady stuff that Twitter was doing. And my main criticism of him is that he didn't act on it. He didn't stand up to Congress in any way. I remember hearings where it was him, Sundar Pichai from Google, and of course Zuckerberg from Facebook, all taken to task by politicians. And I think it was the Senate at the time, although it might have been that. I think it was the House, actually. It was the one I was watching last, who, one after one, they were just tearing these people apart. And Dorsey, at the time, was the only one who sort of was like pushing back in some way, like, Twitter should not have the right, should not reserve the right or whatever to control what people say, to decide what's true or not. He was the one making the most noise about it during those hearings, but he didn't act on it in any way. He just did whatever they wanted him to do. And so I get the sense that he had the awareness and didn't do anything with it, which for me, if anything, is more damning than Zuckerberg, who's just like a corporate whatever, just trying to make cash. I don't know. Peter, I know you're on Twitter. I know, partly we're talking to you because you think about this stuff. You have opinions, and you use the platform. What's your take on that with Jack Dorsey and the free speech angle?
Well, the interesting thing is the paragraph you're quoting is actually one that I posted saying, hey, so if you've watched my free speech documentary or you've read my book, this is the stuff that I've been saying. They're basically saying the opposite here. Like they're talking about how their role is not to be bound by the First Amendment. They need to focus less on free speech. And they start talking about how the scarce commodity is attention. Well, you start thinking about whose speech is prioritized here? Well, who has money? It's the larger companies, the advertisers, the people who have the ability to promote tweets, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, his whole thing about free speech, it's kind of hollow. I feel like he made noise to maybe appear favorable to people who really do care about free speech. But as you said, he never really acted on it. Like they run a platform that is very explicitly, you can figure out who has free speech on the platform literally just by a traditional sort of Marxist class line conception of that. If you don't have ownership of something or you don't represent somebody who owns something, you have a much harder time saying what you want to say on the platform if what you're saying is controversial or contradicts something in the mainstream narrative. Like what they've always been doing obviously, legally speaking, they're not obligated to follow the First Amendment. You'll see on almost any platform where somebody discusses free speech, somebody saying, well, freedom of speech is only so that the government doesn't restrict your speech. And you'll get that a million times. But when you really think about it, the government in a lot of these cases represents capital interests. It represents maintaining that line I referred to earlier, where some people don't have the same ability to speak that some others do because of ownership or the amount of money you have or whatever. Free speech I mean, Twitter, in my opinion, makes it very obvious that there is no free speech. The speech costs something. And if you have money to push what you want to say, you have the ability to say what you want to say. You can also go to other more governmental decisions like Citizens United. You can that sort of track of things. So my criticism is that Dorsey, I don't think that he ever really cared. I think that he knew that,
Agreed.
The line that was always sort of touted by the EFF, like this internet utopia where, the little guy has the ability to express themselves. I think he always liked the idea that people bought that image. But in my opinion, his business model is so focused on sort of restricting the actual mechanics that there's no way that was ever really a priority for him.
No, he needs to vocalize. He needs to make the vocalizations so that the people who couldn't tolerate him, if he were clear about where he was ultimately going to fall on this one, so that they'll keep using his platform, basically. So that people were like on your end or my end who, kind of don't want to necessarily be moderated, or you think it down a couple of iterations and you're doing the class analysis looking at, the profit motivation and how that's going to affect the informational environment. I see it that way too. I have other lenses, but like a bunch of people extremely skeptical of these social networks. And I think Dorsey, more than the others, was in touch enough with that culture to do that vocalization thing. Twitter is a weird sort of outcast version of Facebook, and that's not exactly right. I don't mean to play that up too much, but there's something a little bit weirder about it where people are like, okay, maybe we can use this. It's not this big corporate monolith, but it's still accessible. Enough people are on it. But that's an image that he created and played to, I would argue, just to keep people using it. And to probably impress some of his Silicon Valley friends who are part of the EFF utopia bubble thing and really hoped that he would push that to its limits. But of course he didn't ultimately. I don't know. Jamarl, you haven't been in on it in a little while.
Well, I think you guys are right. Look, I think part of the issue for Dorsey, he made this point about not wanting to overshadow the company. Like he needs to be big enough to basically lead it and not necessarily be in the way of it. I don't know if that's just from the pressure of not being able to satisfy two sides, because there's no win. There's no way out of it. Congress or various people are going to want you to hold information. Some people are going to want you to allow more information in. And if you're either Dorsey, Google, Facebook, or any of these people, you are stuck in this kind of weird quagmire of dancing between the raindrops in order to say, okay, we're going to be part of free speech, but not be part of free speech. And we need to thread that needle in such a way where we elegantly get out of this without people hating us. It's possible he just got sick of it. And maybe he doesn't think that he's the person to be able to do it. I don't know. What do y'all think about that part? Like if this is just one of those things where it's an issue of pressure, it's like, all right, look, I like having the platform, but I am not the person who can take this forward. Either because I'm too much of a luminary, meaning I'm too big in regards to the eclipse that I have on this platform, or my own politics kind of bleeds into the platform in a way that disadvantages the platform. Or is it just sick of it? It's kind of hard to know what's in his head about what's going on with it. But I would imagine that part is a pain for anybody to try to manage and to deal with, this notion of trying to, what do you show versus what do you not show? The section 230 stuff or 220 stuff. But Peter, from here on out, what happens to Twitter? If you had to guess, and maybe the way to ask that question is not just what happens to Twitter, but what should happen. Meaning, how do you make Twitter better? And, and do you think they're going to go that route? I guess that's probably the way to put it.
Well, when they say this was an Agrawal quote. He said the scarce commodity today is attention.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I've been saying since at least 2015, I've been trying to get people to conceptualize attention as kind of a currency that is used online. And if you see things that way, you can see how the market dynamics are at play in all of these social media. Like, this directs them more or less to sort of do these engagement-focused algorithms. Like they say, the other quote that he said here was directing people's attention to leading a healthy conversation that is most participatory. Right there, you have like the tension in what Dorsey has always been doing. I think the thing that would be best for Twitter, not necessarily best for their profits, the thing that would be best for Twitter is to revert to the non-algorithm homepage for everybody, so that you just see everything in chronological order.
Yeah.
So that it's not jamming stuff in your face based on what it thinks you want to see, and instead listens to what you clicked follow on. But I don't think they're going to do that. They're always going to be. It's going to be more algorithmic at all times. Like I think that, again, we've had that sort of tension in what Dorsey says and what Dorsey does. We have a guy who's been more or less involved in all of Dorsey's major decisions, according to Dorsey, over the last several years. I'm going to say that he's probably just going to continue moving towards more algorithmic. And I think that there was a quote where this gentleman, I've seen some controversy about talking about how they're not going to be allowing people to post photos of other people on without their permission or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know exactly how true that is or exactly what that policy is, but it seems like there's probably going to be more restrictions in terms of free speech, which is not, in my opinion, a good thing.
No, it's not.
It might be for advertisers who want more control over a platform, creating a more ad-friendly environment. But I also think there's also going to be more engagement-focused algorithms that are causing more arguments. And that's going to be the tension that Twitter always is. There's never going to be one that wins out over the other. And I think that it's just going to continue and probably get worse.
That's unfortunate.
What about, I'm curious, Peter. Oh, thank you. Well, Peter, what's your take on, I'm sure you've heard of this stuff, are familiar with it peripherally. Like Web3, and it's this sort of like crypto thing where they're talking about, they're doing social networks. They're talking about, it's like a bunch of different ideas that I see, and I don't know if it's connected to the NFTs, the non-fungible tokens. But my point is, coming back around, I've seen a bunch of people talking about Web3 and how, okay, this shows you need another Twitter, you need to recreate something, you need these kinds of things. But in this crypto ecosystem, have you been following that at all? We hadn't talked about it, but just curious, Peter.
I'm a little bit familiar with it, but I'm not like massively familiar. I'll say I am not sure how that's gonna fly, because
yeah,
when they make another social network like a Parler or Mastodon, which is kind of the decentralized anarcho-communist version that, to be honest, I like even less than I like Parler. It doesn't seem to really catch with anyone other than like a certain demographic. And if they're gonna make a crypto-focused one, it might catch with the crypto people, and not catch with everybody else.
That makes sense. Out of curiosity, because I know you will have set some people's heads on fire. I don't have a dog in this hunt, but what's you don't like Mastodon? Why do you not like Mastodon?
I'm just not a fan of the sort of, okay, so the reason why Twitter works, despite the fact that there's so many things wrong with it, is that it is a place where you can go for basically all of the types of opinions on something. You can go there and you can see what everybody thinks about it, and it will jam the argument into your face, like I said, and which is annoying. But at the same time, my gripe with that is more like the argument could be a much more consequential argument than whether or not incest is okay. But the point is everybody is there, and where you have something like a Mastodon or a Gab or a Parler, it turns into kind of an echo chamber, I don't like just seeing I'm not an anarcho-communist. I'm a hard Marxist-Leninist, but I don't like seeing a bunch of people that I ostensibly could have a conversation with, and they'd most likely say yes to all of the things that I'm saying.
Yeah.
I like actually seeing a real conversation, and for better or worse, Twitter is at least, more. It leans more towards that than any of these sorts.
You got more of that. Yeah, you got more of that ferment going on, the sort of cultural ferment where things are mixing around and you have a sense of, wait, who's this popping up? Why are they saying something crazy? And sometimes it's not crazy and it turns out to be brilliant, and you find somebody new and you learn something. That 100%. But Jamarl, when you were asking the question, how do you make Twitter better? My mind kind of goes to, okay, there's this classic trichotomy. There's exit, voice, and loyalty. Exit is you just leave whatever service you're complaining about. Voice is you try to change that service. And loyalty is you stick with it. You know, an exit, the implication is you're switching to another one. So Mastodon, Parler, those are the ones that people would be switching to. The algorithmic change you're talking about, Peter, where instead of showing algorithmically sorted posts, it just does it chronologically, just a pure timeline. I think that's the number one thing that a lot of people want. But you know, and I think the implication there is that you don't get shadow banning, which is clearly a large part of it. I don't think we've even used that phrase on here, but a large part. The problem with it is, Peter, I see what you're saying when you say Twitter has these ranges of opinions. But what I know is, or what at least I'm pretty sure of, on any given controversial, timely issue, some of those opinions, even if I sense that, okay, I'm getting all these different takes, I'm not seeing some of them. Yeah. Because Twitter is going to be pushing them out. You know, there is that sort of automatic filtration. And I get what you're saying. And that's what I would value. And that's why in the best universe, any social media platform, Twitter, Facebook, any, is going to do that thing that you're talking about where you see all these different perspectives, but it's exactly what we're complaining about in some sense, is that filtering, that automatic, okay, no, you can't see it. You can't even see it when they DM it to you. You can't even, literally, you've got to use like Signal for your DMs and Twitter for your posts or something like that. It's all on such shaky ground. I don't know how you fix it, because even with the timeline thing, if they're still just stopping you from seeing certain posts, you know, but I think your recommendation would be just stop doing that, right?
Yeah, I can't imagine, like, and here's the thing, like, you as the user, if you were the actual, like, customer that Twitter was serving, I think that would probably matter. But the thing is, you're the product, you're the commodity that they're selling the data of and the capability to advertise to all these other companies. So their job is to sort of maintain you as opposed to cater to you. And in a perfect world, it wouldn't be like that. They would be catering to us, and we would be saying, you know, I want a timeline that is, you know, based not on your algorithms, but based on what I've clicked follow on. I want to be able to see all of the posts, even the ones that I essentially don't agree with, because that's why I'm on your site. I'm on that site rather than, you know, Mastodon, because I don't really just want to hear somebody say that
they agree constantly. It's like, yeah, I agree with this guy constantly. You know, the wild part about that is, as a software engineer, that seems to just be a flag that you can hit. And I don't quite know why they don't put that on there. I mean, granted, well, that's not true. I do know why they don't do it. I mean, if a person, it seems like you should just be able to go into your settings and say, okay, how do you want your information to flow? Because they're only pulling the stuff from a database and then just kind of putting it on the screen. They can show you anything. They could have a thing whistling Dixie if they wanted to, in the way that they present information. The information, it's this kind of weird, alluring feel, because you're not just directly related to the world in this. There's an intermediary between you and whatever you're seeing, and that's basically code. And so on some level, somebody is basically making a choice on what to show you, as opposed to you making a choice on basically what to see. But that just seems like that would just be a flag for you to say, okay, yeah, I just want the latest. Or I just want the people who I follow, or I just want X or Y. But they don't give you that. And I suspect they don't give you that because of advertisements, because of things that they're trying to get for their own metrics. And like you said, this notion of trying to get people to kind of go at one another on the platform in order to up engagement. That's what it seems like. But Peter, I'm going to give you the last word on this. Any other comments before we close out?
Well, that paragraph we were referring to, the one with the focusing less on free speech and the participatory algorithms and the commodity attention, all that stuff. I'm just gonna. Is it all right if I just plug my documentary?
Absolutely.
Addresses all that.
Absolutely.
Free speech. It's called Free Speech Extreme. It's on my new Very Important Documentaries channel, which you can go to youtube.com/veryimportantdocumentaries and watch right now.
Very cool and timely. Very timely. Peter, thank you, my man. I always appreciate these conversations. The voice that you guys were listening to is Peter Coffin. He's a video essayist with over 250,000 YouTube subscribers, podcaster, and author. In their book, Custom Reality and You, they explore how reality works in a world where profit is the driving force, relatable humor, and a commitment to everyday people keeps their left perspective fresh, fun, and most importantly, sharp. You can follow Peter on YouTube, Patreon, and Twitter at Peter Coffin, and purchase their books on Amazon. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Hi, I'm political analyst Garland Nixon.
And I'm political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist Dr. Wilmer Leon.
We're the co-hosts for The Critical Hour, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C.
We close out your day with a thorough and hard-hitting analysis of the day's top stories, where we bring in brilliant scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time, when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show,
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. So there are several things that are coming up this month, and even by the end of this week. One has to do with a budget. The budget needs to be passed, and a stopgap measure needs to be passed in order to extend funding to 2022. But we also have the debt ceiling that needs to be done by December 15th. And up to this point, neither of those things have a pathway to getting done, at the very least, not that we know of yet. So to have a conversation about the repercussions of either the debt ceiling or even, for that matter, the government shutting down, we're joined with the one and only Mark Frost. He's an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, recovering libertarian. Mark, what's going on, my man? How you doing this morning?
I'm doing well. I'm suffering inflation because I had to buy a new car battery.
You're suffering inflation. I feel you on that. I think you and a lot of people are. You know, it's wild. The debt ceiling is coming up on December 15th. And basically, they said they're going to run out of money by December 15th if they don't get anything passed. And up to this point, I'm not even sure if they have a pathway to do anything, short of, let's say, budget reconciliation. But I don't necessarily think they're going to be able to do 3 budget reconciliations. I'm not sure. I mean, if they're trying to get the BBB passed. What is going on with this? I mean, what are the repercussions if they don't raise the debt ceiling by the 15th?
The repercussions, and I will fully admit to being a little schizophrenic on this, because it's one of those things that you get tired of, because it seems like every quarter
it's an issue.
They play this game of brinksmanship, and at the last day or the last week, they come to an understanding. It would be like you, Jamal, if you had a credit card almost maxed out and you're living on it, and then you call your bank and say, if you don't increase my limit, I'm going to go bankrupt, and then I won't pay you at all. So they raise your limit, and then they raise your limit, they raise your limit, and eventually it just gets boring, because it never actually happens. But I will confess, I don't know what the percentage is, but the 20% of me almost wishes they would do it.
Well, they keep bringing it up. I mean, and it's one of those things that shouldn't be there in the first place. And yet it's something that they've just started to use almost as an active, just as a basis of it going, as a way of trying to screw over whoever the opposition is on this front.
Maybe. Maybe, but
exactly right.
But
yeah.
But also, okay. But on the other hand, is it ripping off? Is it calling their bluff if they do it and it's like, okay, just do it, guys? Is that calling their bluff, or is that ripping off a Band-Aid in some sense? What actually happens if we go past it? Is this one of those singularities? What happens if we break the debt limit, Mark?
Some severe things actually happen. What people rarely realize is that the 4th largest single item in the United States budget is the interest on the debt.
Mm-hmm.
Notice that, and so the first is Social Security, second is Medicare, third is Medicaid, and 4th is interest on the debt. Notice the military and the justice system and the educational system isn't even in that top 4. So right now, interest rates are pretty low. And that's one of the reasons why some people argue the government ought to be borrowing because it's so cheap to borrow, have a lot of infrastructure. It's in many ways, it's the monetary justification for Build Back Better, that sort of a thing. But here's what happens. The United States is a relatively young country, but if you just look around at the age of the governments of various countries around the world, we have a very old government. And so if they did this is sort of the nuclear option, because for the first time, we would not be able to pay the interest for whoever owns United States Treasury bonds. We would default. Now, almost everybody that holds them knows they're not going to get burned, that even if they didn't pay on time, that they would pay later, but it would be a symbolic act. And one of the things I always try to convey to your listeners is that what moves markets isn't events, it's expectations around events.
Right.
And if we don't increase the debt limit, it really is a nuclear option, because it's a signal that the United States, as the supreme financial powerhouse of the world, is over.
Because we're talking about an increase in, once before, I believe it was under Obama, they increased the interest rates basically on the United States because they thought the government was so incompetent or so broken that it didn't have the capacity to do basic things like basically pay its bills. And so it's like coming around, we're talking about the stock market crashing. You have other countries around the world basically losing full faith in the United States' ability to pay its bills, or for that matter, even function.
Selling off a lot of their reserves of the U.S. dollar too, probably.
Yeah, that too. It would be cataclysmic, I would imagine, right, Mark?
Yeah, and it would certainly be massively disruptive. Now the anarcho-capitalists, the hardcore libertarians, are like, do it. Best thing that could ever happen is that we lose our credit, because what do you do to an addict? You take their drugs away. So there are millions of people that probably have that view in this country. I think it's irresponsible, because the people that would suffer if that happened, if you want to talk about inflation, if that happened, everything foreign would increase in price, because part of the United States' blessing monetarily is that the U.S. dollar is still seen as a safe haven. It's still the predominant currency of commerce, and we get the benefit of that demand boost for the U.S. dollar. And I think what you're referring to, Jamal, about Obama was when the bond rating agencies reduced
that's it, the credit rating.
Right. They reduced the rating of the U.S. Treasury bonds from AAA to basically AAA minus.
Right.
That was a signal. And what that does, think about it. You're not a patriotic American. You're a foreign investor, and you're investing in U.S. Treasuries because it's a safe haven. If all of a sudden it looks like there's a probability you're going to get burned, you're going to require a risk premium. You're going to want to buy that bond cheaper than you usually do, and there's an inverse relationship between interest rates and the price of bonds. So as demand for U.S. Treasuries go down, that increases the yield on Treasuries. From our perspective, that means we pay a higher interest rate, and that's the doomsday scenario. I believe I'm pretty sure I'm right. I believe 66 countries are effectively dollarized, meaning they peg their currency to the U.S. dollar. So not only would this affect the United States, this would affect the entire world, just because we're such a powerhouse when it comes to the global economy. So my question is what it's always been. This is gamesmanship. It's political posturing. But at the end of the day, they're going to raise the debt ceiling.
Well, here's the thing. I think you're 100% right about it being gamesmanship right now. But this same line of rhetoric that's used for games right now could be revived in a couple of years, not too long, if you get a Republican or even a Democrat, frankly, administration, albeit a far different one from Biden's. But if you get an admin in that wants to significantly change America's financial standing, and admittedly, that's a long road to hoe. And Jamarl, you were right when we were talking about this before. Dropping the dollar as their reserve currency is really not in the Overton window. It's brought up only to dismiss it when it's brought into conversations. But for the anarcho-capitalist, and I agree with you, Mark, when I think we should do something like that, it's only when I'm feeling particularly stark about the direction that America is going in right now. But isn't there an argument for doing something like it, albeit more gracefully than just not paying our debts? Isn't there an argument to be made for switching out of being the primary, even one of the primary reserve currencies? Because after all, there are benefits in terms of being able to import goods more cheaply. But it was, I think, rightfully put under Charles de Gaulle's administration that the reserve currency privilege is an exorbitant privilege, both for other countries and for the country that holds it. For the United States, sure, we can buy goods from China more cheaply, but who do we sell our goods to? Which is why, we stopped manufacturing, even high-tech manufacturing largely. We've outsourced that, and now we do some R&D locally and the manufacturing overseas. The idea is, isn't there an argument to be made for reversing that trend and not fully de-dollarizing or whatever globally, but stepping away from that position so we can get back to some of those things and, no longer have a disincentive to create your own goods? What's your take on that, Mark?
Yeah, there's absolutely an argument to be made. I don't think I would make that argument, but somebody making it and making it well, I would not think was a kook or nuts, because the argument for doing that is you can't be the hegemon forever. Great Britain probably had the longest tenure of being the international hegemonic power that sort of controlled global commerce and things like that. But even they came to a point where they didn't want to do it anymore. I mean, after World War II, the Bretton Woods structure that was set up, the United States essentially invented the entire world monetary system after World War II. Europe was in shambles. A lot of Asia was in shambles. If you wanted to buy a washing machine, for instance, in 1945, you probably got it either from an American company or an American company doing business that set up manufacturing in Europe and Asia. That's just the way it was. They were bombed out, destroyed, bankrupted. And so we still, as Americans, in many ways, wake up every morning with that post-World War II mentality that we're the world's policeman, we're the world's cop, we're the world's hegemonic power. And what worries me is less about the monetary system and about whether or not the debt ceiling's raised or not. What worries me is the game theoretic framework of this, because from a conservative perspective, they don't want to give up that hegemonic position that the United States has. And any hegemon is going to have a global enemy at any specific period of time. And right now, it looks like that's China. And this is how wars get started, and it's how limited wars become full-blown wars when things change. And the things that are changing aren't liked by the people that are in power. That's what actually worries me. It's really a game theory type component, because what has to happen after World War II was that nations that were impoverished and destroyed are going to be rebuilt, and they're going to rise. And we either need to be part of that or we need to be against that. My personal view is that we need to be part of that. But there are millions of people that would have a different opinion, and they would argue the exact opposite that I'm arguing.
Well, I think we all. This is an interesting enough conversation that we haven't gotten into too much with you before. That I'd be super interested in coming back to it, because you and I disagree on this one. But I think we're good conversation regardless. We're pretty much out of time. I mean, just my very, very brief comments on this is we did that, I would argue, and there are criticisms of the way that the U.S. handled the post-World War II transition, the post-war transition. But I would argue that we did that. We set up these institutions, and there are problems with them, but we've already sort of done that purpose. And I think, if anything, we're inhibiting the growth of productivity for sort of misguided reasons by doing a lot of the things that we've been doing with the wars. But Mark, always really like talking with you. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Appreciate you. Mark Frost, for those listening, is an economist, professor, consultant, drummer, Eagle Scout, Marine, capitalist, Schumpeterian, and recovering libertarian, and a great guest, great guy to talk to. Thanks again, Mark. We're going to be going into a break. We'll be coming back in a minute with our headlines and the last hour of this show this morning. Thank you, everybody, for listening. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the radically independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Very cool. Really good show so far. Let's keep the energy going. Let's get into the headlines. In the news. Yesterday, in the United States, there were 108,601 new COVID cases reported, along with 1,550 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of about 83,120 cases per day, an increase of -2% from the average 2 weeks ago. 59% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 70% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 48,520,095 people across the United States and has killed an unfortunate 780,843 men, women, and children in America. Top U.S. government officials are considering requiring everyone who enters the country to be tested for COVID-19 the day before their flight and having all travelers, including U.S. citizens and permanent residents, be tested again after returning home, regardless of their vaccination status. Officials were deliberating the potential changes Tuesday night and found no decisions have been made, but the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention confirmed in a statement that the agency is working to revise testing requirements for travelers because of the new Omicron variant. Moving to national news, a 15-year-old boy is in custody after 3 students died and 8 were injured in a shooting Tuesday afternoon at a high school in Oxford, Michigan, according to authorities. The Oxford High School student killed were a 16-year-old boy, a 14-year-old girl, and a 17-year-old girl, Oakland County Undersheriff Michael G. McGabe said at a news conference. CNN is suspending primetime anchor Chris Cuomo, quote, indefinitely pending further evaluation, unquote, after new documents reveal the cozy and improper nature of his relationship with aides to his brother, former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo. Those documents were released Monday by New York's Attorney General Letitia James. You guys can check out the first segment. We did the monologue, and we had Ted Rall have a really good conversation on this very specific point. This was at the 7 o'clock hour. A woman who testified Tuesday in a sex trafficking trial of Ghislaine Maxwell said she met the close confidant of Jeffrey Epstein and the billionaire businessman when she was 14 and eating ice cream with friends at a camp where he was a benefactor. Jane, she's basically anonymous, but they're using this as a placeholder, described in graphic detail incidents of sexual abuse with Maxwell and Epstein. With Maxwell at times joining in, both in Palm Beach, Florida, and in Manhattan when she was 14, 15, and 16 years old. Investigators in New Mexico were authorized by state judge Tuesday to search an Albuquerque prop store where some of the rounds used on the set of the film Rust prior to the fatal shooting in October are believed to have been supplied. Of course, Rust is where Alec Baldwin ended up shooting one of the people by accident, killing one, injuring another. In international news, Tel Aviv, Israel, has been named the most expensive city for living for the first time in a new survey by the Economic Intelligence Unit. And for holidays, there are a ton: National Christmas Lights Day, National Package Protection Day, National Peppermint Bark Day, Rockefeller Center Christmas Tree Lighting Day, Romania National Day, World AIDS Day, National Cookie Cutter Week, and National Hand Washing Awareness Week. That should be every day. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yeah, that should be every day. I mean, the hand washing thing shouldn't be something that is, you do for 1 week. That should just be.
I was thinking, What if you could take these holidays, we've been reading these more. Austin introduced us to the habit. He started to put these holiday headlines in there, and they're a good way to, they beef out the headlines a little bit. They're interesting. But I was thinking, like, what if you took these really seriously? Like, each day you could look at what holidays there are and do whatever it's supposed to be on that day. So today it's National Peppermint Bark Day. That's pretty easy to celebrate. Rockefeller Center Christmas tree lighting. It's a little bit harder. I'd have to go up to New York, but you could do that. World AIDS Day. That's a bit more complicated. I guess you could go out and
give aid to somebody.
Get AIDS or give aid to somebody. That's right. No, that's the one to do.
Anyway, go out and get AIDS.
I don't know how you handle that.
It's like I want to be participating in this day so bad. I just need to find somebody to get AIDS from. Yeah, that would not be good. That would not be
National Cookie Cutter Week. National Hand Washing Awareness Week. Those are the easiest, I think, of these ones to do. And National Christmas Lights Day. Everybody's, actually, we need to get a Christmas tree in this house. But a lot of people are doing that anyway. So most of these would be pretty easy.
We should get one for the studio. It'd be cool.
Oh, yeah. Over in the corner there? Oh, yeah. Oh,
yeah, totally. There's another story that's breaking. It's not breaking. It came out on 29th, but I think it's important. Pentagon chief orders new inquiry into U.S. airstrike that killed dozens in Syria. So this was a story we covered a while back where basically an airstrike killed, I think it was like 60 people, some to that effect. Basically women and children predominantly. We had the recent airstrike where they killed, I think it was 6 or 7 women and children. But in this case, there were like 60 people who were basically killed from this. And again, civilians, non-combatants. And of course, the Pentagon basically said it was a clean murder of all of those people and kind of just swept it under the rug. Nothing to see here, folks. Well, after the reporting on it, and I suppose it turned into somewhat of a lightning rod, the Pentagon is basically ordering a new inquiry into the strike. Now, I don't know what they're going to find out the second time that they didn't know the first time around. And it's like, well, they believe that the New York Times, based on their story, they were trying to conceal the civilian casualties. Well, yeah, of course they were trying to conceal the civilian casualties. Or even if you don't necessarily conceal it, basically give it a pass. I mean, that's exactly what they did in that last strike in Afghanistan. They basically said, it's unfortunate that these women and children basically died. However, we wouldn't have necessarily did anything different in this particular scenario, which is, I don't know if there's anything more damning than coming to that conclusion. You're basically saying, yes, I get that we killed all of these women and children. However, our procedure allowed us to do this. And so there was nothing else we could do. We followed all of the book. We followed the procedure. So, it's unfortunate, but sorry, those women and children had to die. Yeah, that's a damning indictment of the program in and of itself. And when you think about it and you put this in context, we were in Afghanistan, 20 years? And what does that look like if you've been doing that for 20 years? I mean, you're talking about thousands and thousands of people basically dead, civilians, that they don't necessarily want to own up to, that the media doesn't necessarily recount or bring up. Never touch the numbers of people that were basically killed in that war. But they're doing a review. You think there's going to be anything coming from this?
I think we'll hear stuff, but I think we'll hear more stuff that we don't like hearing because it reveals how bad we've been doing all along. But no, I don't think in terms of actual repercussions, no. What do you think?
No, I don't either. I mean, I think what happened was initially the New York Times runs the story and people are somewhat aghast by the fact that yet all of these people died. And if you are the United States has a tendency to want to save face, meaning they care about how the reputation, even though oftentimes, we use all sorts of hypocrisy and everything else, that even just from the standpoint of due diligence or just from the standpoint of optics, it's like, okay, it looks bad that we've killed all of these women and children and tried to hide the fact that we killed all of these women and children. And so Austin wanted to seem, above it all, or at the very least seem to be fair or seem to care about this stuff. He opens up another investigation into the airstrike. But it's a secondary thing on whether or not they're going to do anything. I mean, because the first question is, why do you need a second investigation? I mean,
and also, we talked with Scott. We talked with Scott about this. And Scott, who's a pretty hard-hitting guy, he's like part of the military. No, that's not right. He has enough. I was going to say he's part of the military establishment, but clearly he's critical of it, and so I don't want to mislead people. But You know what I mean? He has enough knowledge of the military establishment that he's able to converse with us as almost as if you were a part of the force, like a mid to high ranking member. It's like, okay, this is how this works, this is how that works. This department talks to that department, that kind of thing. And I'm sure, obviously, he still has contacts and people that he talks to. Anyway, that is all set up to say this. When we've talked to Scott about this one, we had a good long conversation with him about the airstrike that we're talking about specifically here. He told us plainly, yeah, no, it's more complicated than that. It's not, is it morally wrong? Yes, 100%. And he was pretty unequivocal, I remember, on that topic. But legally, what are the repercussions going to be? Who is actually responsible? Because what he laid out for us was you have a central chain of command that's giving orders to, depending on the country, we're talking about Afghanistan, Afghanis, but it could be Iraqis, local civilians, basically, local sort of military, pardon me, not civilians, local military personnel that we've trained up.
Right.
We're giving orders to them through a couple of chains of command. They're giving orders back to us, requesting an airstrike, and there's basically no supervening ability to gather information on the target of that airstrike. So what you have is a local Iraqi or Afghani, cases again vary depending on the country you're in, giving orders to U.S. officials who carry them out. Now, who's responsible for giving that order at that point? Everybody, or therefore nobody? You know what I mean? And that's not even, I'm talking morally there. He was saying legally, it's murkier than, oh, no, this is clearly unconstitutional, or clearly this was an unjust call. He gave a pretty solid explanation, I thought.
I mean, even honestly, somebody who was, I guess there were multiple people that were watching it at the time that it was taking place. And they said, who fired that missile? Because at that point, they realized you've just murdered all of these women and children. That's not a situation that these guys were trying to bomb or blow anything up. I mean, I think Scott's point in that situation was, I think it was the way you described it, basically, that it gets murkier from a legal standpoint in regards to what was taking place. He even went further, though. He even made the point of saying the people who would have been in the ability to know, meaning the person who was basically looking at that particular scenario, had no role in basically advising the bomb strike, meaning he was out the loop. That even though some of the people were watching it, the people who were watching it that could see what exactly was going on weren't necessarily in the loop in regards to the command loop. So regardless of what they saw, it didn't really matter. The people who were involved in it were the ones that were basically carrying out the strike. I mean,
it's like one department handing it off to another department, and you have secrets, like levels of confidentiality about the target of the strike. I think it was the CIA working with the Pentagon, but also working with local Afghani government forces. To execute this stuff. Now, that would sound almost like a defense. It would sound almost like I was saying Scott was apologizing or something like that, or defending what happened here. Au contraire, what he was saying was that the problem with unclear leadership and a sort of unclear chain of command, is itself a major problem, and the kind of like institutional failure that leads to this kind of thing happening with nobody being held accountable for it. And that is ultimately, I think, that's the true take on this. It's, here's the system makes it happen. This is the system, and this is how it works, and it's not good. You know what I mean?
Like
we need to fix it up. We need to change it.
I mean, if you do everything right, and at the end of everything right, you have 60 women and children dead, then something's wrong with what you're doing. Just flat out. I mean, the number of civilians that were killed over the 20 years is astonishing. I mean, there were reports where it was like 90% of the people being killed were civilians at times. I mean, just astonishing stuff. Or you're not even hitting terrorists at that point. You're just, every so often you hit a terrorist, you're basically mowing down civilians. And so, I mean, yeah, if you come away and you are like, yep, everything's great, we did everything right, and all of these people are dead, yeah, that's a damning indictment of whatever you're doing in regards to the way you're prosecuting the conflict. Not to mention, you don't even need to be there in the first place. Meaning, it shouldn't even be that way because you shouldn't even be there.
Yes, exactly. We should. Oh, by the way, we're taking calls in this next segment. Then we're going to be speaking with William Craddock at 9:30. So in about 15 minutes, we're going to be talking about the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, Jeffrey Epstein, all that. But I just wanted, since we're not taking calls at the end of the hour, 202-521-1320 is the phone number if anybody else wants to join us in this next segment. But when we were talking to Scott about this, it came to mind, and I'd heard it. I'm not saying I was the originator of this thought, but it came to mind pretty strongly for me at the time. This idea, we should, we're getting into these situations where, the statistics you gave, that sounds. Let's just take it. 90% of people, an overwhelming majority of the people that we're killing, can be described post-mortem as non-combatants. What lands you in that situation? It's a total war, occupation-style way of dealing with local forces, whether insurgents or just the population, and it's not even our own country. I'll put it like this. This would not be better, but I'm saying if it were like the United States is trying to annex one of these countries. You're trying to annex Afghanistan. You're trying to integrate the citizens, that kind of thing. At least you have a moral sense to distinguish, because they're going to be your citizens. You have a moral sense to distinguish between, okay, these are the combatants, these are the civilians, because what you don't want to be left with is, in your own country, among your own citizens, the sense that you were indiscriminately killing large groups of the population. But at a certain point, this is on the other side of the world, we don't care. We're just there. And maybe some people care, but it's not in the way that you actually care. It's in this sort of conceptual sense of caring. I think you see what I'm saying. Yeah. We're waging this total war and complete other part of the planet, which sets you up for that moral disconnection and this sort of like aloofness to what's actually going on, where you don't pay attention. You don't need to pay attention exactly to who you're killing, because at the end of the day, it's going to be this other country's problem. You don't need to deal with it. It's tragic, man.
It is tragic.
That's just, it came to me strongly talking about it.
And it keeps happening over and over. I mean, whether it's knocking over a country, let's say in South America or something like that, in order to get some kind of resource or item, whether it's geopolitical influence, let's say for something like Syria or Iraq. It's almost as if you remember Chelsea Manning, one of the things that she said when she came forward was basically, I told, because I thought this is not a way that we need to be running this particular campaign. We're not doing, meaning there was a disconnect between what they were saying they were doing versus what they were actually doing. And, part of the reason she blew the whistle was in order to kind of bring attention to it. Well, she was somewhat gullible in that. But yeah, it's not good. Agreed. Let's do this. Let's take a break. We're going to be taking your calls. Coming back, 202-521-1320. 202-521-1320. We'll be back in a moment. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys just so happen to be in the D.C. area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM at 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps makes this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So we have Tarif from New Orleans. Tarif, what's going on, my man? How you doing this morning?
Thank you, Jamal. Thank you, Shane, for taking my call. First, I got two comments dealing with China and Africa. But first, I like to say hashtag free Julian Assange, free Deng Xiaoping, and hands off Haiti. Monday, China made a serious power move twice. Two game changers, two major game changers. The first game changer is the most serious of all. They're going to invest heavily into Africa now, into the countries, into Africa.
They were already doing that.
Initiative.
They've been doing that for a while.
Oh, no, this is something different, bro.
Okay, go for it. I'm sorry.
It's going to be heavily invested. I'm talking about they're going to try to bring Africa out of poverty and They're going to try to bring in healthcare, medical, all that, innovation, talking about technology and research dealing with the African continent, investments with agriculture and businesses. They're going to tell their businesses in China to invest in African businesses, right? And they're going to build, it's going to go last, to 2035. So that's a major, seriously major game changer. And the second game changer is that they're donating 600 million vaccines to Africa. It's a billion, actually it's a total of billion, 600 million donations, 400 million is going to come through working with different African countries where they're going to make their own with Chinese help with factors, which they already got $1 billion in Uganda, in Egypt building $1 billion pharmaceutical factory. By that alone, that going to help out Africa a lot, especially with the pharmaceuticals side, dealing with now these vaccines is almost companies are almost becoming like OPEC. Well, they can decide on what's omitted and what's permitted. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Or what's coming like on OPEC, where the price of oil is going up or down based on how many vaccines they can produce or who can produce them. So the price of Pfizer basically going to go down now since that was put out there. But the main thing was about China is going to use their 1.4 billion population to help out African population, which is going to bring a number up to 2.7 billion. You need just go read the articles, Jamal. This is big.
No, I'll check it out. I mean, it does sound big. I mean, if you are trying to establish yourself in the world, especially, you don't necessarily go to this kind of well-worn territory. Africa is ripe for development. I mean, it really is. And, especially if you can bring it up in a way where they are in allegiance with you. Meaning if you can strengthen Africa as a continent, the various countries in Africa, and you are allies with those countries in Africa, that is pretty big. I mean, that's huge. I mean, we're talking about all sorts of mineral resources, all sorts of human capital. I mean, the works. And so, but I guess my point was, my wife and I, we went to Kenya, I think this was several years ago. And I remember reading articles where they were making a point of saying America abandoned Africa to China, that type of stuff. Abandon is too strong. And of course, that was just the opinion of that particular author. But it kind of gets across this point of how invested China is currently in Africa. I mean, I remember they even had casinos that were basically Chinese casinos. That's how many people were there from China. They had that much of a presence there. So yeah, if they're up in it, even better. I don't have any issue with that. Shane, what are your thoughts?
I'm just listening. Interesting topic. I mean, also 1 billion vaccine doses part of this, not direct investment, but in terms of, and it's not just optics, but we keep going because of course that's actually a lot of vaccine doses that's going to affect a lot of people, and particularly in the population centers among more established cities with an older population. That's going to potentially save a lot of people. But my point in setting it up that way is, that's optics too. That's the prestige. That's the prestige race with these vaccines. And okay, who has the most vaccines to throw around? Whose manufacturing capacity is big enough? Who has the enough extra to share? It kind of reminds me of, in a lot of different early societies, of course, you'd have clans and kins, and what tended to organize them was, okay, who can give the largest gifts in a weird way becomes the leaders. Who has the most to share? Is an interesting sort of anthropological thing where it kind of impresses people. And so for China to be giving this, to be throwing this much around, and of course, again, these are doses. This isn't just money or just a figurative thing. This is an actual impact, but still, from a prestige point, is also a big win. And I think that that's going to get more people's attention, but arguably less important ultimately than the infrastructure investments that Tarif is talking about.
Yeah, it's indicative of wealth and competence. I mean, the ability to be able to produce it in one case, and the wealth to be able to, have the numbers and everything else. Yeah, I agree with you.
And this sense of morally who is expected to do those kinds of things. Well, for an American audience, we expect our government to be the one giving charity to African nations. You know what I mean? That's just the sort of stereotype. And so those perceptions for an American audience specifically, let alone the rest of the world, I think are going to be a real big impact. But in terms of actual infrastructure and the other stuff that you were bringing up, Tarif, also, of course, big factors.
Yeah. Tarif, anything else before we go?
Yeah, the Amin Khan thing is basically somewhat prejudiced how they limiting the southern parts of Africa with the travel ban. Even though they was the first ones to discover it, it doesn't mean that it's already around the world. And just to come to find out, they have some European countries that had it, seemed like maybe before Africa had it. And Nigeria is getting a $3.2 billion loan from Africa, and the United States was trying to give up a $2.1 billion loan, and the Nigerian diplomat told him, like, you got two dowries, one higher than the other. Which one you think the woman going to decide on?
One that's higher.
We had China. Yeah, so China is amazing in the world, is rising in the world. You got the No More movement is gaining steam now. The people in Mali is taking it and saying it no more imperialism, no more colonialism. And China is the ones that step into the gap along with Russia to help out Africa. It seemed like India too, because they're building up some coal, like a coal mine in Botswana. So everybody else there, but in the United States, we want our troops there. But
it's funny. We always say there's this impression that Africa is a poor country. And if you think about the resources and everything else that's in the country has pretty much everything. I mean, it's not a poor country. It's just undeveloped. There's somewhat of a difference in those things. And so whoever is going to be able to invest the money into it, whoever is going to give them the better deal for it, and if China's going to do it, China's going to be able to reap the benefits from it, from diplomatic and, for that matter, economic. I mean, it's on some level, it's a win-win if they're going to be able to make their contributions to the country. This puts me in mind of, I think it's Bolivia. Is it Bolivia? I believe it's Bolivia. Yeah, Evo Morales, where he was making a deal. Bolivia has a huge amount of lithium. I mean, that was, one of the main things for batteries. And because lithium is for batteries and we have all these new devices and everything else that basically requires batteries, especially if you're doing with solar power, you need somewhere to be able to store that solar power at the point where that solar power is basically appropriated. And so the lithium thing became huge. And so China was willing to basically work with Bolivia, not just in this kind of relationship where they just take, but also assisting them basically developing there, meaning developing the workers and everything else there to get them more familiar with using the tools and more familiar with the technology and everything else, where they're just not extracting, they're also giving. So if they're going to do that in Africa, yeah, that's a win-win. I mean, that's what it seems to me. Tarif, thanks, my man. Always appreciate these stories. You always point us in the direction of stories that are quite often on point and really interesting. And we end up using a lot of those stories that you give us. So thanks, my man. All right. And thanks out to Tarif. Yeah. So coming up, we have a conversation with a gentleman named William Craddock. And
former guest on the show. It's been a while. It's been a long time.
I don't remember. I honestly don't remember. I remember Disobedient Media. I remember that. He's basically founder and editor of Disobedient Media. I remember that, but I don't remember him.
Yeah, and I there's stuff about this that I don't know. I know that he took a step back from it for a while, and I don't want to get too much on just because I don't know it. Yeah. But I know he took a step back from it for a while, but I still see him around on Twitter. We were texting back and forth for just a minute yesterday or the other day as I was booking him. But yeah, very interesting guy, very, very informed about what's going on with Jeffrey Epstein and of course the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, which we want to do our due diligence, especially as I don't feel like the coverage of it, it's such a weird but also objectively important story in my opinion that you want to make sure you have good coverage of it. I think he'll do a great job. We used to talk to him about it all the time, of course.
Yeah, it's a massive story. I mean, to put it mildly, not to mention the trial is going on. And I get the feeling this trial is going to go on for several weeks. I think they said 12 weeks or something. I could be wrong. I just remember seeing it earlier. But I guess my point is, depending upon what comes out in this trial and some of the information that comes out, this trial could be massive. I mean, no, it's not Epstein. But because of the connections, it's very possible that the evidence they were going to use against Epstein on some level may have tethers to Maxwell, especially if they were as close as the allegations say they were. So, yeah, it should be very interesting. So let's do this. Let's take a break, and we're going to bring our guests in. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment with William Craddock from Disobedient Media. Back shortly.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show by any means necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts and stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our capital from Washington, D.C. And we've been having this conversation about the Ghislaine Maxwell trial that's taking place right now in New York. Some of the testimony that came in yesterday was talking about a young girl, she was 14 at the time, that was basically groomed by Epstein and by Maxwell, and eventually led into, let's say, deeper and darker sexual exploitation. So to have a conversation about this case, this trial, and some of the things associated with Maxwell's life, we're joined with William Craddock. William Craddock is founder and editor of Disobedient Media. William, thank you for joining me, man. How you doing this morning?
Oh, doing good. Hope you guys are doing well.
Yeah, so far so good. So let's talk about this trial that's taking place in New York. I'm curious, what are your expectations going forward for this particular case? And is there anything, I guess, that you want to start off with in regards to your perspectives of, I guess, Maxwell being caught? I mean, famously, Epstein ends up losing his life in prison, whether it was taken or whether he took it himself. I think I lean more towards the side that it was taken. But either way, it seems that all of the people that Epstein was connected with, you have Bill Clinton, Bill Richardson, you have Donald Trump, you have all sorts of political and economic people. And it's like the moment that he passed, nobody believed he was going to make it out alive. He just so happened didn't make it out alive. But it seems like the investigation almost went up in smoke immediately after he passed, despite the fact that there were all these tethers to all of these other people that might have been doing some nefarious, dubious things with Epstein. So what are your thoughts and expectations for this trial going forward with Ghislaine Maxwell?
Well, I think the disappointing thing about this trial is that the focus is going to be more on how Maxwell was procuring women for Epstein. Certainly the testimony that we've seen so far has focused on that, and I think that's going to remain the focus of the trial. Some of the attorneys who've represented various victims of Epstein in the past have expressed some frustration about this case because there's really not going to be too much new information that we're going to learn as far as Epstein's connections, the blackmail schemes he was running, maybe, where he was getting some of his money. And none of that is likely to come out in court. There's actually two unnamed, unindicted co-conspirators who've been cooperating in the case, whose names will not be released, who we won't learn about. And I think that, it's as much about who is in court as who is not in court. Maxwell is now arrested. Others like Jean-Luc Brunel have been arrested as well. But, some of the other high-profile individuals who faced allegations, Lex Wexner, Alan Dershowitz, for example, have not faced any kind of consequence, and they're still walking free. In the case of Dershowitz, for example, he's actually keeping an incredibly high profile. So, in a way, it's good that the victims are getting this additional chapter of closure. But there's still so much being left on the table, and it really shows you the limits of the justice system in dismantling a conspiracy of this size and scope.
You step into that for the moment. You made the point about blackmail schemes and everything else. There were all sorts of suspicions that Epstein was either working with intelligence or that he would basically use, let's say, the pedophile island as a way of getting information on various people to hold over their heads for some kind of leverage and some kind of influence. Talk about that for a moment. And could you make a really good point about, these are questions that are circling Epstein and have been circling Epstein ever since all of this came to light. And yet the trial is not necessarily going to delve into any of this.
Right. Epstein's one of his biggest skills was his ability to make himself necessary to people, to get himself into a position where people owed him or he had something that people wanted. There were allegations, and there have been allegations in the case of other similar criminal conspiracies where the people at the center of it were selling information to foreign intelligence agencies. But it wasn't just the intelligence aspect. I mean, Jeffrey was, if you look over his whole life, he was a guy who could get himself into all kinds of very prestigious international institutions and establishments and get his way to where he'd be able to rub shoulders with very high-profile people.
Basically, how was he able to do that? I mean, and that was always the question. I mean, because it seemed like he came out of nowhere.
Yeah,
and
it seemed almost like he was set up. It seemed like, sorry for jumping in, but it seemed like he was set up to do this thing. It seemed like he was chosen in some way, and maybe he chose himself. And I'm not trying to say that it was simply, I'm not trying to assume a definite causality in either direction. My point is, it seems like he had he was a schmoozer, and he was obviously intelligent, and obviously had these perverse proclivities, but also it seemed like from fairly early on with, working with A.G. Barr's dad, I'm forgetting the name of his father, but William Barr's father, as a sort of math tutor, developing connections there. I believe this was near to New York City, and then insinuating himself where suddenly, fairly quickly, it seemed like he had become effectively a protege of Les Wexner's, a larger transhumanist. I'm briefly and undoubtedly slightly inaccurately painting the broad outlines of Jeffrey Epstein's rise to prominence in this weird cabal. But my point is, he got to that position so quickly that it seems like somebody wanted him to get to that position, right? And well, I don't just broadly, because I also want to talk about the specifics of the cases, the other cases that you kind of mentioned a couple minutes ago, William. But just what's your take on the idea that he was set up for this position decades ago?
I think there's some grain of truth to that, but at the same time, Epstein was the type of guy who was extremely good at networking and making sure he was in the right place at the right time. There were points early on in his career where he almost, when he was on Wall Street, almost lost his job and was able to talk his way out of it. This is a guy who really knew how to make himself indispensable to people and to stand out. Despite not having the type of pedigree that he needed to be where he was.
Yeah, it's such a very strange case. I mean, to put it mildly. I mean, do you think, from the standpoint of Maxwell, that she's going to use any information that she has at her disposal to kind of, I guess, save herself or to cut down on the time frame? I mean, Ted Rawl was saying, why on earth are they having a trial? It looks like she's in trouble. But is it a situation where, and I guess you can exit in two ways. Was Epstein potentially going to do that? I remember hearing something about Epstein potentially using his sources or information or the contacts that he has at his disposal to try to save himself, whatever save means in this case. But I guess the question becomes, how far does the rabbit hole go with Maxwell? And will she also be able to use that information in order to try to either cut time down off of some kind of conviction or something or to that effect? You mentioned before that there were multiple co-conspirators associated with it that haven't necessarily been named, which is basically, it sounds like they're basically giving information to the state for Maxwell, even though they were on some level a part of it. So I guess what I'm getting at is she going to spill the beans? Is she going to talk in a way that tries to save herself?
Well, if she was going to do that, the window for doing so is closing. It seems like her attorneys have chosen a strategy of emphasizing the fact that Epstein, would create a very transactional aspect to the way he would groom and abuse people. Not only was his relationship with a lot of the people he knew so socially or professionally very transactional, but with the victims, it was the same thing. People who were being abused were then being subsequently offered major career opportunities, financial opportunities, which they wouldn't have otherwise had. And I think that, for a lot of the victims who have not come forward, the relationship was very transactional. They let Epstein do something, and in return, they were given some sort of an opportunity which they wouldn't have had. That was one of the ways in which I think he was able to escape scrutiny for so many years.
Makes perfect sense. And as a power broker, he's exactly in the position of setting himself up that way. That's the part of the whole point, is to avoid scrutiny through the assumption is blackmail. Can you go over some of the other cases that are active or that, even if inactive, I don't know, could be promising in some way? Just, you frame this in terms of closure for the victims here, but I think for a lot of people, there's this question of, okay, there's this Pandora's box that we see right in our periphery or something like that we haven't fully addressed in public yet. This whole, network of people who are involved in this potentially. On that angle, not just for the victims getting restitution or peace of mind, but for the public to learn more about who these other people that were involved, what they were doing, who they specifically were, whether there was a larger network, what that network looked like, that whole thing. Any cases that seem at all promising for opening that end of the conversation up, William?
Right. Well, in addition to the various criminal prosecutions against Epstein, there were also a number of defamation cases between various victims of Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and other high-profile associates of Epstein who were accused of misconduct. Alan Dershowitz, for example, was involved in a number of defamation suits with some of the victims. Additionally, there's a possibility that there may actually be future litigation for other individuals in this network as well. The unindicted co-conspirators who've been cooperating in the Maxwell case have not been given, from what I understand, have not been given immunity from prosecution. Former Epstein associate Leon Black is also apparently under investigation. So it's possible that we may see more to this story going forward. It's just impossible to say at this point, what prosecutors are going to feel comfortable moving forward with and what they're not.
Can we go into the past a bit for Maxwell? Who is Ghislaine Maxwell? And maybe that's too broad of a question, but I guess her origins, like for example, her dad, he apparently was working closely with Mossad, and this was before she met Epstein. But how did she come to, I guess, public recognition outside of Epstein?
Yeah, she made her name as a socialite. Her father was a fairly famous businessman. Was rumored to have ties to British intelligence, Israeli intelligence, possibly Russian intelligence. Was a guy who moved around a lot in those types of power circles. Maxwell leveraged his political and social connections. And moved around in those worlds, making a name for herself and networking with people. That's more or less how she got her start initially, and it's the way she met Epstein.
And introduced to his daughter, Robert Maxwell, bringing Jeffrey Epstein in, setting that connection up before just a couple of years later. Reports vary as to exactly when he made that introduction, but assuming it's in the late 1980s, Robert Maxwell died in 1991. So a couple of years later, he died. Earlier on in the show, I mentioned Ghislaine Maxwell, Lady Ghislaine, the yacht that was originally built for a Saudi oligarch, member of the Saudi royal family, then purchased by Robert Maxwell, renamed to Lady Ghislaine. He actually died under suspicious circumstances after supposedly falling off that boat while sailing, but other people believe that he was pushed. In other words, died under suspicious circumstances on a boat named after the person currently being prosecuted in this case. Just another sort of weird narrative for people interested in learning more. It's almost trivia, except it might not be. That was how central she was in his life. He introduced Epstein to her. The connections with Mossad, which I believe were confirmed at his funeral. I would, again, some of the stuff confirmed at a key event. Do you happen to know what I'm talking about there, William, where his connections to Mossad were confirmed in Israel by like a high-ranking Israeli government official at a key point at some event. Do you know what I'm referring to there, William?
I'm not familiar with the specific event, but I mean, there's been a number of people from the intelligence world who've discussed his known and suspected ties to intelligence agencies.
Absolutely, yeah, in a weird way. And again, it's this sort of murky backstory of what's set up here. I want to switch back for just a second to the other cases. Virginia Roberts-Giuffre is one of the higher profile victims in all these cases. What appearances has she made during the Ghislaine Maxwell trial? And with the defamation thing, that involves Dershowitz, right? These are separate topics, admittedly, but I know Dershowitz and Virginia Roberts-Giuffre going at it with each other over the issue of defamation. But just back to it, how has Virginia Roberts-Giuffre appeared in this trial so far? William?
Well, she's one of the victims who's providing testimony in this trial. I don't think anything she discusses will be too different than what she's already talked about in public and in other cases. She's merely retestifying as to what she's already mentioned in the past. But yeah, she was involved in a defamation suit that Maxwell and Dershowitz were parties to. That became kind of it's been kind of a mess because Dershowitz has sort of been sniping in these cases and filing a few himself where he appeared, as a party primarily, but has been kind of sniping at these cases, trying to unseal evidence from them that he might be able to use to go after victims. And he's been going at Virginia Roberts in particular, I think because she's been the most public and the most high profile in accusing him of misconduct. But in my personal opinion, his story has changed in material aspects on a number of occasions, enough to call into question whether he's being sincere about his denials or not.
I'm curious about something. When Maxwell was first apprehended, she was basically making this argument that she was covered by, to go back in time a little bit, Jeffrey Epstein initially got a sweetheart deal from Acosta. Acosta basically saying, this is above my pay grade, but basically gave him a deal and didn't even tell the people who were his victims that the deal was basically made with Epstein, where Epstein got like work release or something to that effect, or he was only in for like a year. But one of the provisions for that was that anybody who was a co-conspirator with him, or I guess there were several co-conspirators, were basically covered under his deal. So whatever agreement he makes for himself, he basically was making this agreement for other people. It sounded as if in the beginning, Maxwell was saying that she was covered under that particular deal and that this prosecution was improper because she was covered by that deal. Does that make sense? Is that the deal that they were talking about when she initially in the very beginning was saying this prosecution is improper? I already had this kind of deal under under Epstein. Or am I thinking about a different, defense that she was putting out initially?
No, that's correct. And that is still a legal argument that the defense is making in this case, is that, there was a non-prosecution agreement that Epstein reached with prosecutors in his initial prosecution, and that agreement should be honored. I don't think it will be because legally it was pretty unconscionable. And I think that, there's been so much outrage about it, I think, online and from the public, that there's just simply no way that she could be let off the hook.
It's also weird because it announces guilt. I mean, for her to make the deal, she's basically saying, look, Epstein got convicted of this. The deal was atrocious, yes, but he got convicted of this. I was one of those people that was a co-conspirator with him as he was molesting other girls. That's basically her argument. I'm guilty, so you should let me off. And I think that's going to be somewhat of a hard argument to make. At the very least, it's going to be somewhat unpalatable, to put it mildly. But does it have any legal legs associated with it? Even if the deal is not great and it seemed very, sketchy, to put it mildly, that he was able to get a deal such as that. Is it still legal?
Well, as far as the argument the defense is making, they're trying to paint Maxwell as the victim in this case. They want to remove the intent element from what she did on behalf of Epstein by arguing that, she had been manipulated by him, that she had been coerced into it, like some of the other women are saying. Because, there's other victims as well of Epstein who were groomed to bring him women and do not exactly the same thing, but some of the similar things that Maxwell did for Epstein as well. So I think they're trying to make that argument, but, the case is extremely weak for Maxwell compared to what it might be for some of the other victims.
Well, and because for the other victims, these were the victims you're talking about. These were the underage ones, right? Where Ghislaine came in as Epstein's partner, and then my understanding is, acting as a madame, she would bring people in for him to have sex with. But there was also this process of recruitment of recruiters, where they would get girls to recruit other girls to come in. In other words, Ghislaine, making that same argument, she's in a completely different, almost a parental position in the relationship with Epstein, as sadistic and, that sort of incestuous comparison would be. But she's in that sort of mature relationship. The other victims that you're describing, they're all the younger girls, right?
Yeah, that's correct. Well, in some cases, it would start when the girls were underage or young, and then they would remain in contact with Epstein for many, many years into their adulthood, and they would continue doing things on his behalf. I don't want to get into any of the specifics with particular victims, but yeah, I mean that has been alleged in a number of cases that these people would maintain, despite being abused by Epstein, would maintain a relationship with him for many years because it was transactional and there were still things that they could do for each other.
I'm curious, where does Prince Andrew fall into this? Has there been any more movement on him, or he's basically just protected because he's in the UK and is a quote unquote, prince?
Well, I don't know. I think that'll be interesting to see how that continues to play out going forward. I mean, certainly he's one of the more high profile people who was drawn into Epstein's sphere of influence. The fact that he's, wanted for questioning and further information in this case does show that, he's not going to be let off the hook lightly. But I mean, I think that remains to be seen. That this is pretty. It's pretty common when this type of thing comes out that maybe you get the people who are the actual offenders, the actual traffickers, who are facing criminal penalties, but a lot of the people who are utilizing these services are not going to face the type of same steep penalties. We saw this with not an underage network per se, but there was I don't know if you remember this, but several years ago there was like a Chinese involved trafficking network, who had a number of high-profile clients operating on the East Coast that was disrupted by law enforcement. One of their clients was Robert Kraft. He was prosecuted, but ultimately a deal was reached, and he didn't face any criminal liability, if I remember correctly, for that. So it's pretty common to see this type of thing where the ringleaders will go face criminal charges, and they just never get around to going after or giving the clients of these networks any serious criminal liability.
You use the term service. Why? Is that the way you see it, as a service? Like that the people, service implies almost as if they were paying for it, or if they were like doing something in exchange for something else. Is that the way you view it?
Yeah, I mean that is the way I think one should think about it. These are networks being run like businesses, and yeah, the people who are utilizing their services, yeah, those are correctly they can be correctly characterized as clients of these networks.
So another way of framing this, of course, is that it's blackmail. In other words, that either they were coerced or set up, or it's not that it was transactional. That's not necessarily included in the narrative, although I'll point out it makes perfect sense. And it's more, of course, implicating for the clients. But why? Why do the clients not get prosecuted? It seems like, of course, they're the ones who are ultimately making this service possible. They're the ones who are, in some sense, directly committing not the trafficking of children, but by benefiting from it, of course, they're directly committing a lot of serious crimes. And, of course, in this case, so many of the quote-unquote suspects, not being charged, of course, but so many of the people who may have committed these crimes, high-profile people. So it seems politically motivated to not go after them. I don't need to say that, but I'll say it. Is that what it is? Why do they not go after these people? William?
I think that there is an aspect of these people being blackmailed, and that their behavior is useful to maybe is useful for certain individuals to get them to do things for them. It also has to do with, I think, cultural attitudes as well. Alan Dershowitz actually years ago wrote an article saying that people who procure prostitutes shouldn't face any type of criminal penalty, and that it should be the pimps and the prostitutes themselves who are the only ones to face criminal charges. Yeah, so I think this partially has to do with kind of an outdated cultural attitude towards prostitution in general, and how people who interact with these services should be treated. I hope that we start to see that culturally changing going forward, because it is pretty important to go after the perpetrators who utilize these services as well.
100%. And Jamarl, I've done a couple ones. I'll hand it back to you soon. But no, briefly on this, I'll put it like this: child porn and like the trafficking of porn of children, for instance, you see constantly, or you'll hear occasionally at least, about, okay, there was a raid on this person, this high profile person, or just this group of anonymous people who, collected it, distributed it, didn't record it themselves, but were in some sense doing the client thing. And I know it's not a complete analogy, but the point being, this is actual rape. This would be direct rape of kids and teens by people. And surely, if the porn is bad, committing the act continuously in your own person with your own flesh, that's going to be worse. It seems like this. If it's cultural, that seems right. But my point is, just legally, it seems like a complete mismatch of priorities from a sort of impartial legal perspective. Maybe I'm missing something. William, what's your take?
Well, I think additionally you have to consider the fact that prosecutors do have to build a case against each individual who's being charged in connection with these crimes. It might be more convenient for them to go after the perpetrators, but when they're doing that, they're building a very specific type of case for a very specific type of criminal offense with its own unique elements that are not going to be the same necessarily, for example, as someone who's procuring the services of these traffickers, of these people who are prostituting others out illegally. So, building the case from a legal perspective also plays into it, because, they're looking for very specific information, very specific evidence and testimony.
I see. The point being, yeah, okay, that makes sense. The prosecutor's trying to go after him in a very particular way. I mean, but I kind of agree with Shane on this. If indeed child porn and having child porn is illegal, like right off the bat, it's like, even if you have it, at that point, you're going to jail for it. It seems like the prostitution itself would also be just as illegal. And maybe this is one of those things just because the people are high profile. I mean, if the people who are using this service, just to stay with the analogy, those might be big names. I remember, I believe it was Nancy Pelosi's daughter. She came out and she said, look, some of the people who may come out or be outed with Epstein's imprisonment may be on the Democratic side of things, because they understood it, that he has so many political connections across the board, that many of these people who we may know, who we may see all the time, may be in the Black Book, or for that matter, might have worked with Epstein for years. And so it's, I think that's the most unfortunate aspect of all this. The fact that Epstein ends up dying in prison, and that the network that he had basically run, you can say established, all that stuff, basically almost went with him in this case. And I get Ghislaine, Ghislaine Maxwell is almost like a runner-up prosecution, but it's not the same. It does feel different. It feels like one was the mainstay and the other one is kind of the groomer associated with it. Was the main person was the one who basically was able to escape life without having to pay for the consequences. But William, thank you for joining me, man. I really appreciate this conversation. This was one of the things that we wanted to get into, just because it's going to be such a big case, and this case is going to go on for a while. But the voice you guys were listening to is William Craddock. He's founder and editor at Disobedient Media. And we've come to another end for today's show. This is Fault Lines. I want to thank the engineer, who's awesome in the back, always dealing with the phones and dealing with the mechanics of the show. I want to thank our producers, some of which are at home, other of which are still working on the show. I want to thank my co-host, Shane Stranahan, who's still a little bit under the weather, but still here nonetheless, putting up the good fight. And I want to thank all of you, the audience who basically makes the show possible. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll see you tomorrow. Have a good one.